The morning Garrett Hollis received a $63,418.27 repair estimate for the dam he had inherited, he didn't call a contractor. He didn't call a lawyer. He called the HOA. They refused to pay a single dollar. Garrett didn't argue. He simply thanked the woman who answered the phone and hung up. That surprised even him. 6 months earlier, after his grandfather Walter Hollis passed away, Garrett had inherited something most people in Maple Ridge didn't even realize existed. Not the lake, the dam. The deed listed it as private property. The inspection reports listed it as critical infrastructure. Neither description felt completely accurate, because every morning, more than 100 families woke up looking at water that only existed because that structure continued doing its job. Most of them had never seen it. The engineering report sat open across his kitchen table. There were no dramatic warnings. No predictions of imminent collapse. No red letters demanding immediate evacuation. Just measurements. Concrete deterioration. Drainage concerns. Routine maintenance that had been postponed for too many years. At the bottom of the final page, one sentence stood alone. Recommended repairs should be completed before the upcoming wet season. Nothing more. Engineers rarely wrote emotional sentences. They expected numbers to do the talking. Garrett read the report again, then a third time. Not because he doubted the conclusion, because he was trying to answer a different question. Why had his grandfather never mentioned any of this? Walter had taught him how to rebuild engines, weld steel, and read survey stakes before he was old enough to drive. He had taught him that maintenance was cheaper than repair, but he had never once said, "One day, this dam will be yours." Instead of calling another engineer, Garrett drove to the small concrete structure hidden behind a line of old oak trees. From the road, it looked almost insignificant. A low-maintenance building, a chain-link fence, a weathered gate. Nothing that suggested it quietly supported an entire lake. He unlocked the gate with the same brass key Walter had carried for decades. The hinges groaned softly. Inside, everything remained exactly as his grandfather had left it. Every wrench had a place. Every binder wore a handwritten label. Every inspection log was dated in careful blue ink. Walter had trusted organization more than memory. Garrett was beginning to understand why. He pulled the newest inspection binder from the shelf. The report was signed by a county engineer, Daniel Pierce. The name meant nothing to him. Not yet. He closed the binder and returned it to its place. Another binder caught his attention. Emergency operating procedures. He opened it only long enough to see the first page. A diagram of the outlet valve. Inspection intervals. Emergency release protocols. He closed it again. There was no emergency. There was no reason to think about valves. Not today. On the corner of the old desk rested a leather notebook Walter had carried for years. Most pages contained nothing more than dates, rainfall totals, and maintenance reminders. One sentence, however, had been underlined so heavily that the ink had nearly pressed through the paper. Concrete doesn't know optimism. Garrett read it twice. He wasn't entirely sure what it meant, but he had learned something about his grandfather. Walter never underlined jokes. Back at home, Garrett opened the Maple Ridge HOA website. Every photograph featured the lake, families kayaking, children fishing from wooden docks, sunsets reflecting across calm water. The words lakefront living appeared 3 separate times on the homepage. He searched for one more phrase, dam maintenance, nothing. He searched again, infrastructure reserve, nothing. He wasn't looking for someone to blame. He was looking for evidence that the community understood what made the community possible. He found none. 2 days later, an email arrived confirming his request to speak at the next HOA board meeting. 10 minutes had been placed on the agenda. No more. The confirmation ended with a single line. Board chair, Barbara Kingsley, another unfamiliar name. Garrett closed the email. He believed 10 minutes would be enough. He had inspection reports, photographs, engineering recommendations, facts. His grandfather had always said facts were stubborn things. Garrett still believed that. He had not yet learned that facts and acceptance were rarely introduced at the same meeting. Before going to bed, he returned once more to the control house. Not to inspect the dam, just to think. The room was silent except for the faint hum of old monitoring equipment. His eyes drifted toward the large cast iron outlet valve standing in the center of the building. Walter had inspected it every year, without exception. Garrett rested his hand briefly against the cold steel, then switched off the lights. He walked away believing the hardest part of the coming week would be convincing a homeowners association to help pay for routine repairs. He couldn't have known that this quiet structure hidden behind a line of trees was about to expose forgotten records, test an entire community's sense of responsibility, and force people to ask a question far larger than who owns the dam. That question would have to wait. By Thursday evening, every chair inside the Maple Ridge Community Clubhouse had been filled. Garrett hadn't expected that. The HOA board meetings were usually quiet affairs: budget approvals, landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, complaints about parking rules, the kind of conversations that rarely lasted longer than an hour. Tonight felt different. Residents stood along the back wall, coffee cups in hand. Several whispered to one another as Garrett walked in carrying nothing more than a leather folder. He wore the same navy blue work shirt he had worn during that morning's dam inspection. No suit, no expensive watch, no attempt to impress anyone. Barbara Kingsley noticed him immediately. She always noticed everything. At 48, Barbara had built a reputation for running Maple Ridge with military precision. Every flower bed looked perfect. Every mailbox matched community regulations. Every lawn was trimmed within HOA guidelines. People admired her efficiency. Some feared it. Few challenged it. She sat at the center of the board table wearing a white blazer that contrasted sharply with the dark walnut furniture around her. A silver nameplate rested neatly in front of her. Barbara Kingsley, board president. She smiled politely as Garrett entered. It wasn't a welcoming smile. It was the smile of someone already convinced she knew how the evening would end. Garrett chose a chair near the front. He quietly placed his folder on the table beside him. Inside were only documents, inspection reports, repair estimates, engineering photographs, county maintenance recommendations. Nothing emotional. Nothing dramatic. Facts. Across the room, Barbara tapped her wooden gavel. Let's begin. The meeting opened exactly as expected. Approval of last month's minutes, pool maintenance update, holiday decoration budget. A discussion about repainting the community entrance sign. Garrett listened patiently. He wasn't impatient. He understood procedure. Good decisions required orderly meetings. Finally, Barbara looked down at her agenda. Our final discussion item, she announced. Mr. Garrett Hollis has requested 10 minutes regarding the dam. Several residents turned toward him. Some looked curious. Others already appeared annoyed. Barbara offered a practiced smile. You have the floor. Garrett stood. He didn't walk dramatically. He didn't clear his throat. He simply opened his folder. Good evening. My name is Garrett Hollis. As most of you know, I inherited the Hollis Dam after my grandfather passed away. A few heads nodded. He continued. Last month, I commissioned a complete structural inspection. He placed a photograph on the projector screen. A close-up image showed hairline fractures running across sections of the spillway. Then another. Concrete erosion. Then another, drainage deterioration. Nobody interrupted. Engineers had a way of making silence feel heavy. Garrett clicked to the final slide. A single number filled the screen, $63,418.27. This is the estimated repair cost. Someone in the audience quietly whistled. Garrett didn't react. If repairs begin this summer, the structure will remain fully operational. He changed slides again, if postponed. The next photograph showed enlarged cracking beneath the spillway. Future costs increased significantly. Still no emotion, only engineering, only probability. Then he reached the final slide, aerial photographs. One image showed only the dam. The second showed the entire lake. The third showed every waterfront home surrounding it, 120 properties, blue water stretching through the neighborhood. Private docks, boat lifts, walking trails. Garrett looked toward the audience. The lake exists because this structure exists. Nobody disagreed. It increases property values. Again, nobody spoke. The engineering report concludes the repairs benefit every homeowner who enjoys the lake. He paused only long enough for the sentence to settle. I am requesting that the HOA share the repair costs. Silence, not uncomfortable, thoughtful. Garrett believed people were considering the evidence. Barbara had already made her decision before the first slide appeared. She folded her hands. Thank you, Mr. Hollis. Her voice remained calm, professional, almost friendly. She glanced briefly toward the board members beside her, then back to Garrett. Who owns the dam? Garrett answered immediately. I do. And whose name appears on the deed? Mine, Barbara nodded. So, she said gently, the maintenance responsibility belongs to the owner. Garrett wasn't surprised by the question. It isn't that simple. He opened another document. The dam supplies the lake that serves this community. The relationship between ownership, maintenance obligations, and community benefit deserves our. Barbara raised one hand. I'm sorry. She smiled again, but we're discussing responsibility. Not engineering, not fairness, responsibility. The HOA cannot spend homeowners' money maintaining private property. Several residents nodded. Garrett noticed. He wasn't discouraged. He expected skepticism. What he didn't expect was what happened next. Barbara stood and walked toward the large windows overlooking the lake. Everyone here purchased homes, knowing the lake was beautiful. She smiled to the Dobangents. And we're grateful to the Hollis family for creating it. Several people applauded politely. Then she turned. But gratitude, she said, isn't the same as financial obligation. More nodding, she continued. The dam belongs to Mr. Hollis. The repair bill belongs to Mr. Hollis. The liability belongs to Mr. Hollis. She looked directly at Garrett. I believe that's perfectly clear. More applause, not loud, but enough. Garrett remained standing. He didn't interrupt. He simply waited until the room became quiet again. Then he asked one question. If the dam failed, Barbara answered before he finished. It won't. Garrett didn't argue. He simply rephrased. If repairs aren't completed, Barbara smiled once more. Then that's a matter between you, she said. Your insurance company, your contractors. She leaned slightly forward. Not this board. Garrett looked around the room. He noticed something strange. Nobody had asked about the engineering report. Nobody questioned the inspection photographs. Nobody discussed increasing repair costs. Nobody even asked what failure would actually mean. The conversation had shifted entirely toward ownership. That bothered him, not because they disagreed, because they were discussing the wrong problem. Engineers always asked, what happens next? Nobody in the room seemed interested in that question. Barbara closed her folder. I'll entertain a motion. A board member immediately spoke. I move we deny the funding request. Second, all in favor, 5 hands. No? None. The motion carries. She looked at Garrett with the same composed smile. I'm sorry we couldn't help. The audience slowly began gathering their belongings. The meeting, for everyone else, was over. For Garrett, it had only just begun. As residents filed toward the exit, several offered sympathetic smiles. One older man quietly whispered, "Tough break." Another shook Garrett's hand. I hope you figure something out. Nobody offered solutions. Nobody asked questions. They simply accepted the board's decision. Garrett didn't blame them. People trusted systems. HOAs existed to solve neighborhood problems. If the board said this wasn't their responsibility, most people assumed the board must be right. Barbara believed the matter had ended with a unanimous vote. Garrett believed the meeting had answered a far more important question, not who would pay, but how the board viewed the problem. That distinction changed everything. He waited until nearly everyone had left. Barbara was organizing paperwork behind the board table when Garrett approached.
I appreciate your time.
She looked up. I know this wasn't the outcome you wanted.
No.
He smiled politely. It wasn't. There was a brief silence. Then Garrett asked, would it be possible to obtain copies of the original development agreements? Barbara frowned slightly. What agreements? The subdivision approvals, the original easement documents, lake maintenance records. If they exist. Barbara looked puzzled. I'm not sure why you'd need those news, Garrett answered honestly. I'd simply like to understand how everything was originally structured. She hesitated. There shouldn't be anything unusual. Probably not. He nodded. But I'd still like to read them. Barbara finally shrugged. I'll have the management office send you whatever we have. Thank you. Garrett closed his folder, turned toward the parking lot, and walked away without another word. Barbara watched him leave through the clubhouse windows. She smiled to herself. She thought she'd just ended an uncomfortable conversation. She never realized she had just handed an engineer exactly what he wanted. Documents. That night, long after the neighborhood lights reflected across the quiet lake, Garrett unlocked the small office beside the dam. He placed the HOA meeting notes beside his grandfather's ledgers. Then, on a blank legal pad, he wrote only one sentence. Never argue with assumptions. Verify them. He underlined it once, folded the paper, and opened the first filing cabinet. Somewhere inside decades of forgotten records, the real story was waiting. Garrett was waiting when the county records office unlocked its front doors at exactly 8 o'clock the following morning. Most people came here only a handful of times in their lives, buying a house, selling land. Replacing a lost deed. Garrett arrived carrying a legal pad, 2 sharpened pencils, and a notebook already divided into sections: ownership, water rights, maintenance agreements, easements, development approvals. He wasn't searching for one specific document. He was searching for the history everyone else had forgotten. The clerk behind the reception desk smiled politely. "Can I help you?" Garrett nodded. "I'm looking for every recorded document related to Hollis Dam and the Maple Ridge subdivision." She raised an eyebrow. "That's probably several decades worth." "That's fine." She turned toward her computer. "Do you have parcel numbers?" Garrett slid a handwritten list across the counter. Every parcel, every survey number, every historical property description. The clerk looked surprised. "You came prepared." Garrett smiled faintly. "My grandfather believed paperwork ages better than memory." 30 minutes later, 3 archive boxes landed on the reading table. Each carried faded labels. 1963, 1974 Subdivision Development Water Resources. The cardboard smelled like old libraries and dust. Garrett carefully opened the first box. Inside were yellowed engineering drawings folded so many times that their edges had become soft. Topographic surveys, original grading plans, construction permits, inspection signatures. Every page carried Walter Hollis's neat handwriting in blue stone fountain pen. Garrett recognized it instantly. His grandfather had never wasted ink. If Walter underlined something, it mattered. Hours passed without Garrett noticing. Most people searching public records skimmed pages. Garrett read every line. Engineers were trained to distrust summaries. The important detail usually lived inside the smallest paragraph. Near noon, he unfolded a subdivision map dated 1987. It showed something curious: the neighborhood roads, the property lots, the lake, the dam. Everything looked familiar until he noticed several thin lines drawn beneath the water. They weren't property boundaries, they were easements. He copied the reference number into his notebook. No conclusions. Not yet. At 1 o'clock, another archive card arrived. The county archivist, an elderly man named Richard Monroe, pushed it slowly across the reading room. "You've been busy." Garrett smiled. "I'm trying to understand how everything fits together." Richard looked toward the old engineering plans. "Haven't seen those in years. My grandfather kept copies." "So did we." Richard chuckled quietly. "Your grandfather documented everything." Garrett nodded. "I've noticed." The older man rested one hand on the cart. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "developers usually care about houses. Your grandfather cared about water." Garrett looked up. "What do you mean?" Richard pointed toward one of the rolled blueprints. "He argued with the county for nearly 2 years." "About what?" "Maintenance." Garrett stopped writing. Richard continued. He kept saying. The archivist smiled as though repeating words heard he decades earlier. "Building something is easy. Convincing people to maintain it is the hard part." Garrett stared at him. "When was this?" 1988, I think. The subdivision was expanding. He worried everyone loved the lake, but nobody wanted to pay for what made it possible." Richard shrugged. "I never forgot that conversation." Then he quietly walked away. Garrett looked back down at the blueprints. For the first time that day, he wasn't reading engineering. He was reading foresight. His grandfather had seen this coming almost 40 years earlier. By late afternoon, Garrett had filled nearly 30 notebook pages. Nothing dramatic, nothing shocking, just facts, dates, signatures, meeting minutes, permits. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Every developer advertisement promoted the lake. Every county approval discussed the dam. Every planning meeting acknowledged ongoing maintenance responsibilities. Yet once the neighborhood became established, those conversations quietly disappeared. The lake remained. The paperwork faded into storage. Garrett reached the final folder inside the second archive box. The cover read, "Lake access and utility easements." He opened it, expecting routine maps. Instead, a single-type memorandum slid onto the table. The paper was dated May 14, 1989. Subject: long-term maintenance responsibilities. Garrett sat a little straighter. He began reading. The memo described the relationship between the private dam and the public benefit created by the lake. Nothing unusual. Then halfway down the second page, one sentence caught his attention. He read it twice, then a third time. "Any future governing association benefiting from the maintained lake shall cooperate in preserving reasonable access necessary for inspection, operation, and structural maintenance of the impoundment." Garrett didn't move. The room suddenly felt quieter. The sentence wasn't assigning ownership, it wasn't transferring liability, but it acknowledged something critical. The governing association benefited from the dam, and cooperation wasn't optional. Garrett didn't celebrate. Engineers didn't celebrate possibilities. They verified them. He copied the document number, checked the signatures, reviewed the recording stamp. Everything appeared authentic. Still, one document proved nothing. He needed context. He requested another archive box. This one contained County Planning Commission minutes. Hours later, another piece appeared. A commissioner had asked during a public meeting, who ensures future maintenance once the community expands? Walter Hollis answered on the official record, ownership and benefit are different questions. Responsible communities eventually recognize both. Garrett slowly closed the folder. His grandfather hadn't been predicting conflict. He'd been trying to prevent it. The courthouse clock struck 5. The reading room began emptying. Garrett packed his notebooks carefully. Before leaving, Richard Monroe returned. Find what you were looking for? Garrett considered the question. No. Richard looked surprised. I found something more useful. The archivist smiled. What's that? Garrett placed one hand on the archive box. The questions everyone stopped asking. Outside, the late afternoon sun reflected across the courthouse windows. Garrett sat inside his truck without starting the engine. His notebook rested open on the passenger seat. He reviewed the day's discoveries. No miracle, no hidden ownership document, no secret clause that instantly solved everything. Instead, he had something stronger, a timeline, evidence. Proof that the relationship between the dam and the HOA had always been more complex than Barbara claimed. But one question still bothered him. If these documents had been recorded publicly, why had no one mentioned them during the board meeting? Were they forgotten or intentionally ignored? As he turned the key in the ignition, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed, Maple Ridge Property Management, Garrett answered. Mr. Hollis? Yes. This is Karen from the management office. I've gathered the HOA documents you requested. Garrett smiled politely. Thank you. There are quite a few. I'll pick them up tomorrow. Karen hesitated, then lowered her voice. Mr. Hollis? Yes? I probably shouldn't say this. She paused. But I think you'll want to read the board meeting minutes from 15 years ago. Garrett frowned. Why? Another pause. Because, she smirked, this isn't the first time the dam has become a problem. The line went silent. Garrett slowly lowered the phone. He looked toward the lake in the distance. The argument he thought had begun 1 week ago had actually started years earlier. Someone had simply buried the paperwork. Garrett arrived at the Maple Ridge Property Management office just after 9 the next morning. The building looked exactly like every suburban management company in America. Neutral paint, artificial plants, framed photographs of smiling neighborhoods lining the walls. Everything projected stability. Everything suggested order. Garrett had learned long ago that appearances rarely revealed how an organization actually functioned. Behind every polished office, there were filing cabinets. And filing cabinets rarely lied. Karen, the office manager, greeted him with a nervous smile. She looked to be in her early 50s, wearing reading glasses attached to a silver chain around her neck. I've got everything ready. She disappeared into a records room and returned pushing a small cart, 3 banker boxes, each overflowing with binders, board minutes, annual budgets, legal correspondence, engineering reports, insurance renewals. Garrett looked at the stack. This is everything? Karen nodded. As far back as our digital records go. And before that, she hesitated. Storage. Off-site? She nodded again. Garrett smiled politely. I'll start here. The conference room they gave him overlooked the neighborhood lake. Residents walked their dogs along the shoreline. Children rode bicycles. Someone was teaching a little girl how to cast a fishing line from one of the docks. The scene reminded Garrett of something his grandfather used to say. People fall in love with the view. They forget what holds the view together. He opened the first binder. HOA board meeting minutes year after year passed beneath his fingertips. Budget approvals, holiday events, pool repairs, tree trimming, street lighting, landscaping. Mailbox replacements, nothing unusual, nothing about the dam, almost as though the lake simply existed by itself. 3 hours later, he found the first reference. It was only 2 sentences. Resident expressed concern regarding dam inspection costs. Board agreed issue belonged to dam owner. No discussion, no vote, no engineering report, just dismissed. Garrett circled the page number, then kept reading. 5 years later, another mention. Discussion regarding emergency spillway maintenance postponed pending legal review. There was no attached legal review, no follow-up, no conclusion, just silence. Garrett wrote another note. Questions were beginning to outnumber answers. Around lunchtime, Karen knocked gently on the conference room door. "You've barely moved." Garrett smiled. "I'm making progress." She looked toward the growing stack of sticky notes. "Find anything?" "Patterns." Karen frowned. "What kind of patterns?" Garrett tapped one binder. The same conversation keeps appearing, but every time it gets close to an answer, he turned another page. It disappears. Karen looked uncomfortable. "I've worked here 17 years. I've never heard anyone talk about the dam until last week." Garrett looked up. "That's exactly what concerns me." By early afternoon, he reached records from 15 years earlier, the period Karen had mentioned. The meeting minutes looked ordinary at first. Routine business, committee reports, architectural approvals. Then one paragraph caught his attention. Executive session convened. Garrett frowned. Executive sessions weren't unusual. HOA boards often met privately to discuss legal matters. What interested him was what happened afterward. The official minutes resumed with only one sentence. Board accepted legal recommendation concerning long-term infrastructure responsibilities. Nothing else. No explanation. No attachment. No vote recorded. No legal opinion included. Just accepted. Garrett leaned back in his chair. That wasn't normal. Not for an issue affecting an entire community. If legal counsel had given advice concerning infrastructure, there should be documentation, unless the documentation had been removed. He walked back to Karen's desk. "Can I ask Yash something?" "Of course. Do you keep attorney opinion letters?" "Usually. For executive sessions too?" She nodded. "If they're submitted to the board." Garrett held up the meeting minutes. "This references legal recommendations. I can't find them." Karen took the binder. Her expression changed almost immediately. "That's strange." She flipped several pages, then stood. "Wait here." 10 minutes later, she returned carrying another folder. "I found the attorney invoice." Garrett looked surprised. "Just the invoice?" She nodded. "The board paid for legal research, but the opinion itself." She searched the folder again. "Is gone." Garrett stared at the invoice. The law firm's name appeared clearly. The date, the amount billed, the subject line. Research regarding dam maintenance obligations, so someone had asked the question. Someone had paid thousands of dollars to answer it. But the answer was missing. Garrett didn't accuse anyone. Not yet. Engineers didn't assume missing data meant misconduct. Files were misplaced. Floods happened. Offices moved. Computers crashed. There were countless innocent explanations. Still, his instincts told him something important had disappeared. He photographed the invoice, recorded the file number, noted the attorney's name, then quietly asked, "Does the HOA still use this law firm?" Karen shook her head. "They retired years ago." Garrett nodded. "Do you know where their records went?" "I honestly don't." As he packed his notebook, Karen spoke again. "There is one more thing." Garrett looked up. "I wasn't sure if it mattered." She opened another drawer beneath her desk. Inside lay a faded accordion file held together with a cracked rubber band. "No one has touched this since I started working here." She handed it to him. The front label simply read, Hollis. Garrett carefully opened it. Inside were miscellaneous documents, old correspondence, insurance certificates, maintenance schedules. Then a handwritten letter. The paper had yellowed with age. The signature at the bottom stopped him cold. Walter Hollis, his grandfather. The letter wasn't addressed to family. It was addressed to the HOA board. Dated 23 years earlier, Garrett slowly began reading. To the members of the board, the first paragraph thanked them for supporting community improvements. The second discussed routine maintenance. The third made Garrett stop breathing for a moment. One day, a future board may be tempted to believe the lake exists independently of the dam that created it. If that day comes, remember this. Ignoring infrastructure never eliminates responsibility. It merely delays the bill. Garrett lowered the page. The room felt suddenly silent. His grandfather hadn't written an engineering report. He had written a warning. Karen watched his expression. "Is everything okay?" Garrett nodded slowly. "Better than okay." He carefully slipped the letter into a protective folder. "This tells me my grandfather knew exactly what was coming." As Garrett walked toward the parking lot, his phone vibrated. "Unknown number," he answered. "This is Garrett." A calm male voice replied. "Mr. Hollis?" "Yes." "My name is Daniel Pierce. I work with the county's dam safety division." Garrett stopped walking. "I've been reviewing inspection records." There was a brief pause. "I think we need to meet." Garrett looked back toward the lake. "What about?" Another pause. Then Daniel said something that made Garrett's pulse quicken for the first time since this entire dispute had begun. "Because, according to our files, your dam isn't the only structure that's been neglected. Somewhere beyond the sparkling water, another piece of the puzzle had just surfaced, and whatever Daniel Pierce had found, it was big enough to make a county engineer call personally. Garrett arrived at the county dam safety office 10 minutes early. Old habits. Engineers respected schedules because schedules respected reality. The building itself was forgettable. A 2-story brick structure tucked behind the courthouse, surrounded by government vehicles and neatly trimmed hedges. There was no polished lobby, no marble floors. Only fluorescent lights and decades of accumulated records. The receptionist looked up as Garrett entered. "Mr. Hollis?" He nodded. "Mr. Pierce is expecting you." She pointed toward the end of a narrow hallway. "Last office on the right." Daniel Pierce stood as Garrett entered. He looked younger than Garrett expected, early 40s, rolled up sleeves, reading glasses resting on top of his head. His office was filled with engineering textbooks instead of law books. Cross-sections of dams hung on the walls. Hydrology charts covered a corkboard. A whiteboard displayed rainfall calculations from the previous month. Garrett immediately relaxed. This wasn't someone chasing headlines. This was someone chasing numbers. Daniel extended his hand. "Good to finally meet you." "You too." They shook hands. Neither man wasted time with small talk. Engineers rarely did. Daniel placed a thick inspection folder on the desk. "I've read the report you commissioned." Garrett nodded. "It's accurate." "I agree." Daniel slid another folder beside it. "This one is ours." Garrett frowned. "I didn't know the county had another inspection." "We didn't." Daniel leaned back. "This is 42 years of inspections." Garrett looked at the folder. Every inspection, every recommendation, every follow-up, everything. Daniel tapped the cover. "The interesting part isn't what's inside, it's what's repeated." He opened the file. The first report dated back nearly 4 decades. A paragraph had been highlighted. Vegetation should be removed from the downstream embankment. Daniel turned the page. 5 years later, the exact same recommendation. Another page. 8 years later, again, another inspection. Again, different inspectors, different decades, same recommendation. Garrett slowly nodded. No one followed through. Daniel smiled. "Exactly." He flipped to another section. Concrete deterioration should be monitored. 5 years later, concrete deterioration continues. 7 years later, repair recommended. 10 years later, repair should not be delayed. Daniel closed the folder. "See the pattern?" Garrett answered quietly. "Deferred maintenance." Daniel pointed toward him. "Deferred responsibility." For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "You've probably noticed something." Garrett already knew. The reports never mentioned the HOA. Daniel nodded. "Correct." "Why?" "Because the county doesn't decide financial responsibility. We evaluate safety." Garrett understood immediately. The legal question belongs somewhere else. "Exactly." Daniel folded his hands. "But here's the problem." He pulled another document from the folder. "This lake exists because your dam exists." Garrett nodded. "If the dam changes, the lake changes." Daniel finished the sentence. "And that affects every homeowner." Daniel stood and walked toward a large aerial photograph hanging on the wall. It showed Maple Ridge from above. The lake curved through the center of the neighborhood like a blue ribbon. Every waterfront lot surrounded it. Daniel pointed toward the shoreline. "Most residents think they're buying lakefront property." "They are," Garrett replied. Daniel smiled. "No, they're buying access to infrastructure." He tapped the photograph again. "The lake isn't natural. It isn't permanent. It isn't guaranteed. It is engineered." Garrett stared at the image. He'd spent his entire career explaining exactly that. Few people ever listened. Daniel turned around. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you asked the HOA for help, were you asking because you couldn't afford the repairs?" Garrett answered without hesitation. No. Daniel looked surprised. "I can finance the repairs." What I can't justify is asking one property owner to permanently subsidize an entire community. Daniel studied him for several seconds, then smiled. I thought so. Garrett frowned slightly. You expected that answer? I've met your grandfather. Garrett blinked. You knew Walter? Daniel laughed softly. When I was fresh out of college, he terrified me. Garrett couldn't help smiling. That sounds like him. Daniel nodded. He had one rule. What was it? Daniel quoted from memory. The numbers don't care who wins the argument. Garrett looked down at the inspection reports. That sounded exactly like Walter. Daniel returned to his desk. I called you because of something else. He reached into another folder, smaller, older, marked. Emergency Operating Procedures. Daniel slid it across the desk. You should read page 12. Garrett opened it. Halfway down the page, he found a paragraph underlined decades earlier. If structural conditions require emergency drawdown, the owner shall operate the primary outlet works in accordance with the approved emergency action plan. Garrett continued reading. No approval from neighboring property owners or homeowner associations is required to initiate emergency operations necessary to protect life, infrastructure, or downstream property. He slowly looked up. Daniel was watching him carefully. I've read this before, Garrett said quietly. Daniel nodded. I figured, but I don't think your HOA has. Neither man spoke for nearly 20 seconds. Finally, Garrett broke the silence. I'm not interested in threatening anyone. I know. Daniel answered immediately. And that's exactly why I called. He leaned forward. If conditions continue deteriorating, there may come a day when delaying action becomes more dangerous than acting. Garrett understood the implication. The valve. The emergency outlet, the one his grandfather insisted be maintained every year, the one almost no one in Maple Ridge even knew existed. Daniel continued. I don't want you thinking about lawsuits. I want you thinking like an engineer. Garrett nodded. Public safety. Daniel smiled. Exactly. As the meeting ended, Daniel walked Garrett toward the parking lot. Before Garrett climbed into his truck, Daniel spoke one final sentence. Can I offer one piece of advice? Garrett closed the driver's door. I'm listening. Daniel glanced toward the distant hills where the lake lay hidden behind rows of expensive homes. When people argue about ownership, they stop paying attention to consequences. He paused. Don't make the same mistake. Garrett drove directly to the dam. The afternoon sun reflected across the reservoir exactly as it had every summer afternoon since his grandfather completed the project. Children were swimming near the community dock. A pontoon boat drifted slowly across open water. Nothing looked different. Yet, Garrett couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's words. The lake wasn't permanent. It only looked permanent because someone quietly maintained the machinery beneath it. He unlocked the small concrete control house beside the spillway. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. The room hadn't changed since Walter's time. Steel handwheels, pressure gauges, original maintenance logs. Everything exactly where it belonged. At the center of the room stood the outlet control valve, massive, cast iron. Paint faded almost completely away. Garrett brushed years of dust from the manufacturer's brass plate, installed. March 1964. He rested one hand against the cold steel. The same valve, same one from the emergency operating manual. The same one his grandfather had insisted be exercised every year. Garrett closed his eyes for a moment, then quietly whispered, not yet. He wasn't making a promise. He was making a calculation. As he locked the control house behind him, his phone buzzed. A text message, unknown number, only one sentence. Stop digging before you destroy this neighborhood. No name, no explanation, no signature. Garrett read it twice, then calmly slipped the phone back into his pocket. For the first time since this began, someone wasn't arguing with his engineering. Someone was afraid of what he might discover next. Garrett had received angry emails before. As an engineer, criticism came with the profession. Every flood wall cost too much. Every bridge took too long. Every maintenance recommendation seemed unnecessary, until the day it wasn't. But this message was different. Stop digging before you destroy this neighborhood. No signature, no explanation, no profanity, no emotion, just a warning. Garrett stared at the screen for several seconds before pressing the power button and slipping the phone into his pocket. Anonymous messages weren't evidence, they were distractions. He refused to let either control his decisions. Instead of driving home, Garrett stopped at the county sheriff's office. The deputy behind the front desk looked up. Can I help you? I'd like to document a message. The deputy glanced at the phone. Threat? I don't know, Garrett answered honestly. It could simply be someone expressing frustration. You still want a report? Yes. The deputy smiled slightly. Most people come in demanding we arrest somebody. Garrett shrugged. I don't know who sent it. I only know it exists. The deputy nodded. I wish more people thought that way. 10 minutes later, Garrett walked out with an incident number. Nothing more, nothing less. His grandfather had taught him long ago. Document first. Interpret later. The following Monday morning, Maple Ridge woke to something unusual. County vehicles. 2 white pickup trucks bearing the Department of Water Resources logo rolled slowly through the neighborhood. Residents watched from driveways as inspectors walked toward the dam carrying clipboards and surveying equipment. Within minutes, neighborhood Facebook groups exploded. What's happening? Is the dam failing? Has anyone heard anything? Rumors spread faster than facts. They always did. Barbara noticed the trucks almost immediately. She was halfway through breakfast when one of the board members called. Barbara, I think we have a problem. She looked through her kitchen window toward the lake. What kind of problem? There are county inspectors at the dam. Barbara frowned. They didn't notify us. They don't have to. The board member answered quietly. They're meeting with Garrett. Barbara ended the call without another word. 20 minutes later, her white Escalade stopped beside the gravel road leading to the dam. She stepped out wearing sunglasses and a tailored cream-colored jacket despite the summer heat. Garrett was standing with Daniel Pierce and another county engineer reviewing elevation measurements. Barbara walked directly toward them. Good morning. Daniel nodded politely. Mrs. Kingsley. She ignored the clipboard in his hands. What's going on? Daniel answered calmly. Routine inspection. Barbara folded her arms. Routine? I've lived here 12 years. I've never seen county inspectors measuring our lake. Daniel corrected her gently. The dam. Barbara looked toward Garrett. You requested this? Garrett answered with complete honesty. No. Daniel spoke before Barbara could respond. The county initiated today's inspection. Barbara's expression tightened. Why? Daniel didn't hesitate. Because engineering reports recommended follow-up evaluations when, for several decades. Silence. Barbara recovered quickly. I'm sure this can be handled without alarming the neighborhood. Daniel nodded. That's our goal. She looked directly at Garrett. I hope you're not trying to create unnecessary panic. Garrett then met her eyes. I'm trying to prevent necessary panic. Neither raised their voice. Neither insulted the other. But every inspector standing nearby understood exactly what had just happened. This was no longer a disagreement over money. It had become a disagreement over responsibility. As Barbara drove away, Daniel quietly exhaled. She handles pressure well. Garrett watched the SUV disappear around the corner. So do dams. Daniel smiled. Until they don't. By late afternoon, the inspection was complete. The county engineers gathered beneath a shade tree overlooking the spillway. No one appeared excited. That worried Garrett more than if they had. Experienced engineers rarely reacted emotionally. They became quieter as problems became more serious. Daniel handed Garrett a preliminary field summary. This isn't the final report. I understand. Garrett scanned the first page. Most observations matched the private inspection he'd already commissioned. Surface cracking, vegetation growth, drainage concerns. Then he reached the final paragraph. He read it twice. Postponements of recommended maintenance may significantly increase future repair costs and operational risks. Nothing dramatic, no sensational language, no prediction of imminent failure. Just professional engineering. Garrett almost smiled, because professional engineering carried more weight than dramatic headlines ever could. That evening, Barbara called an emergency HOA board meeting. Not public, board members only. The atmosphere inside the club felt noticeably different from the previous week. No to discuss landscaping. Nobody mentioned holiday decorations. Instead, everyone wanted to know one thing. What if Garrett is right? Barbara remained composed. We don't know that he is. One board member shifted uneasily. But now the county is involved. Barbara nodded. They're inspecting infrastructure. They're not assigning liability. Another member spoke. Should we at least consult legal counsel? Barbara paused. It was the first time anyone had suggested reconsidering. Finally, she answered, yes, but quietly. Garrett spent the evening reviewing another box from his grandfather's office. He wasn't looking for evidence against the HOA anymore. He was looking for context. How had Walter managed this relationship for decades without constant conflict? Near the bottom of an old filing cabinet, Garrett discovered a spiral notebook. The cover simply read, Maintenance Journal. He flipped through the pages. Each year's entries looked nearly identical. Lubricated outlet valve, inspected spillway, cleared vegetation, checked drainage. Routine, methodical. Then one entry from 31 years earlier caught his attention. Met with HOA representatives today, nice people. They asked whether the dam would always take care of itself. I laughed. Concrete doesn't know optimism. Steel doesn't care about budgets. Water always wins if people stop paying attention. Garrett slowly closed the notebook. His grandfather hadn't been cynical. He'd been realistic. The next morning, Garrett's phone rang again. This time the caller ID displayed a familiar name. Richard Monroe, the county archivist. Garrett answered immediately. Richard, you asked me last week why nobody mentioned those old maintenance documents. I did. I think I found the answer. Garrett sat up straighter. What is it? Richard lowered his voice. I was reorganizing retired planning files, and I found an index card. Garrett waited. It references another storage location. What kind of storage? Richard hesitated. The county doesn't use it anymore. It's an old records warehouse outside town. Garrett frowned. What's there? Richard took a slow breath. I don't know. But according to the inventory, that's where the original development files were moved. Garrett looked out the window toward the lake. If Richard was right, the most important documents in the entire dispute had never disappeared. They had simply been forgotten, or left exactly where someone hoped no one would ever look. The county records warehouse sat nearly 15 miles outside town. It had once been a distribution center for highway maintenance equipment before the county converted it into long-term archival storage. The building wasn't marked on most public maps anymore. If someone didn't know it existed, they'd never find it. Garrett parked beside a faded loading dock where patches of rust had slowly overtaken the old steel doors. Richard Monroe was already waiting. The archivist stood beside a pickup truck carrying 2 flashlights and a ring of oversized keys. He looked almost embarrassed. I haven't been here in years. Garrett smiled. Neither has anyone else, apparently. Richard gave a quiet laugh. That's exactly why I'm worried. The heavy door groaned open. Dust floated through shafts of morning sunlight. Row after row of industrial shelving disappeared into the darkness. Thousands of cardboard archive boxes stretched across the warehouse. Each carried faded inventory numbers. Some had not been touched in decades. Garrett looked around. This is where they sent everything? Richard nodded. When the county digitized most records, they kept only the files considered legally significant. And the rest? Richard gestured toward the warehouse. They ended up here. Richard pulled a folded inventory sheet from his pocket. The index card referenced section C. He looked around. Which should be somewhere over there. The two men walked between towering shelves stacked nearly to the ceiling. Boxes labeled. Drainage, districts, road, easements, subdivision files, water management. Every aisle represented decades of forgotten decisions. Garrett wasn't looking for a miracle. He was looking for continuity. Paperwork rarely disappeared by accident. It simply moved. After nearly 20 minutes, Richard stopped. This should be it. A faded metal sign read, Section C17. He checked the inventory again, Maple Ridge Development. Shelf 4. They counted slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4. Garrett reached for the first box. The cardboard nearly crumbled beneath his fingers. Its label had faded almost completely away. Only one word remained legible. Mapples inside, nothing looked remarkable. Engineering correspondence. Survey maps. Planning commission agendas. Exactly what Garrett expected. He carefully placed each document into neat piles. Richard watched quietly. You really do read everything. Garrett never looked up. My grandfather used to say. He smiled faintly. The sentence that changes your life is usually surrounded by pages everyone else skipped. Richard chuckled. Sounds like Walter. The first hour produced nothing new, only confirmation. Original grading permits, construction approvals, drainage calculations. Everything matched the documents Garrett had already found downtown. Useful, but not decisive. Then Richard opened another box. This one isn't on the inventory. Garrett looked over. The label simply read, Legal no year, no department, no description. Only one word. Richard frowned. That's odd. Garrett took the box. Inside were dozens of sealed legal envelopes. Most remained unopened. Each referenced different county developments, shopping centers, bridges, industrial parks. Then Garrett found one stamped, Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. He froze. The envelope had never been opened. The county seal remained intact. Richard leaned closer. "Can we open it?" Garrett looked at the date. 1990, he nodded slowly. "I think we're supposed to." Richard carefully broke the brittle seal. Inside lay only 3 documents, a cover letter, a legal memorandum, and an engineering attachment. Garrett immediately recognized the law firm's name, the same one listed on the missing HOA invoice, the opinion Barbara's board minutes had referenced, the opinion no one could find. Neither man spoke. Garrett unfolded the memorandum carefully. The paper had yellowed with age, but the type remained perfectly readable. The first page summarized ownership. Exactly what everyone already knew. Walter Hollis owned the dam. Nothing surprising. A second page discussed liability. Again, nothing unexpected. Then Garrett reached the third page. Everything changed. The attorney had written, "Although ownership of the impoundment remains private, the Homeowners Association derives substantial and continuing benefit from the maintained lake." Garrett kept reading. "Future boards are advised that refusing reasonable cooperation regarding preservation of the dam may expose the association to foreseeable legal and financial consequences if community interests are materially affected." Richard slowly lowered his glasses. "Well," he whispered, "that's considerably different from not our problem." Garrett didn't answer. He was already reading the engineering attachment. The attachment came from the county's consulting hydraulic engineer. It wasn't legal. It was technical. It explained in plain language something every future board should have understood. The lake wasn't self-sustaining. Its water level depended on the continued safe operation of the dam. Deferred maintenance increased long-term costs. Emergency drawdown procedures existed to protect both the structure and downstream communities. Most importantly, the engineer warned that delaying maintenance often forced operators into decisions no homeowner ever wanted to face. Garrett slowly closed the report. His grandfather hadn't hidden the truth. The county hadn't hidden the truth. The attorneys hadn't hidden the truth. Someone had simply stopped passing the truth forward. Richard looked across the warehouse. "What happens now?" Garrett answered without emotion. "I verify everything." Richard smiled. "You already have the opinion." Garrett shook his head. "I have a copy. I still need to know whether the HOA received the original." Richard understood immediately. Evidence wasn't just about what existed. It was about who knew and when they knew it. As they packed the documents into archival sleeves, Richard stopped. "There's one more thing." Garrett looked up. Richard held up the cover letter. "You skipped the last paragraph." Garrett frowned. "I did?" Richard handed him the page. The final sentence read, "Copies transmitted to County Planning Department, Hollis Dam owner, Maple Ridge Homeowners Association president." Garrett stared at the distribution list. 3 recipients, not 1, not 2, 3, which meant the HOA board had almost certainly received the legal opinion decades earlier. Garrett folded the letter carefully. For the first time since this dispute began, he wasn't asking whether the board should have known. He was asking a far more uncomfortable question. Who chose to forget? That afternoon, as Garrett drove back toward Maple Ridge, his phone buzzed. A local news alert appeared. Maple Ridge HOA calls special meeting alleging dam concerns. He frowned. The county hadn't released its inspection report yet. The board hadn't contacted him. So why call an emergency meeting now? He pulled over and opened the article. The statement from Barbara was only 3 sentences long. Recent speculation regarding the Hollis Dam has created unnecessary concern among residents. The board wishes to reassure homeowners that there is no immediate danger and that legal responsibility remains unchanged. Garrett read the statement twice. Then he quietly placed the phone back on the passenger seat. She wasn't responding to engineering anymore. She was responding to public opinion. And once a conflict shifted from facts to perception, it became much harder to control. As he turned onto the road leading toward the lake, he noticed something that hadn't been there that morning, a television news van parked beside the community entrance. The story had just become public. By sunrise the next morning, Maple Ridge had become the county's newest headline. Not because the dam had failed, not because anyone was in danger, but because uncertainty had finally become public. A single television news van had turned into three. Satellite dishes unfolded beside the neighborhood entrance. Reporters stood along the lake shore rehearsing introductions, while camera operators searched for the perfect backdrop. The sparkling water, the expensive homes, the peaceful image that contradicted the story they were about to tell. Garrett drove past them without slowing down. He had no interest in speaking to the media. Facts didn't become stronger because cameras were pointed at them. At 8:30, his phone rang. Unknown number. "This is Garrett. Mr. Hollis?" A woman's voice. "This is Melissa Carter with Channel 7 News. I'd appreciate 5 minutes of your time. I'm afraid I can't help you. You've become the center of an important story," Garrett answered calmly. "No, the dam is." Without waiting for another question, he ended the call. An hour later, Barbara stepped confidently onto a small platform inside the Maple Ridge clubhouse. Every chair was occupied. Residents stood against the walls. Some had never attended an HOA meeting before. Now they filled the room. Fear attracted attendance far more effectively than free coffee ever could. Barbara adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for coming." Her voice remained steady, professional, controlled, exactly as Garrett expected. "We've all seen the recent media attention." She paused, allowing murmurs to settle. "I want to reassure everyone. Our neighborhood is safe." Several residents visibly relaxed. Barbara continued. "There has been unnecessary speculation regarding the Hollis Dam." She smiled politely. "The board has reviewed the situation. Our legal position has not changed." A few homeowners applauded. Others looked uncertain. Then someone raised a hand. It wasn't a board member. It was an elderly man sitting near the back. His name was Frank Delaney. He had lived beside the lake for almost 30 years. "My question isn't about ownership." Barbara nodded. "Go ahead." Frank leaned forward. "It's about maintenance." The room became quiet. "When was the last time the board actually discussed paying for the dam?" Barbara hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. "We've consistently followed legal guidance." Frank nodded slowly. "I didn't ask that. I asked, when was the discussion?" The silence lasted noticeably longer this time. Barbara opened her binder, turned several pages, closed it again. "I don't have those dates in front of me." Another resident spoke. "If the county is inspecting it, doesn't that mean something changed?" Barbara answered immediately. "The county performs inspections regularly." A woman near the front frowned. "My husband works for the county. He says they usually inspect because someone requests follow-up." Barbara's expression remained calm. "But that doesn't change ownership." Again, ownership. Garrett wasn't even in the room. Yet the conversation had returned to the same word, ownership, not consequences. Outside the clubhouse, Garrett stood beside the lake, watching from a distance. He had intentionally chosen not to attend. There was nothing he could add. The community needed to ask its own questions, not hear another argument from him. His phone vibrated. Daniel Pierce. "You watching the meeting?" "No. I can hear it from outside." Daniel laughed softly. "Probably healthier that way. What do you need?" "I've finished reviewing yesterday's measurements." Garrett waited. "The settlement near the spillway has increased." Garrett closed his eyes briefly. "How much?" "Enough that I want another survey." "Immediately?" "Immediately." Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Garrett asked, "Is it dangerous?" Daniel answered carefully, "No." Then he added, "But engineering isn't about waiting until the answer becomes yes." Inside the clubhouse, another resident stood, a young woman named Emily Foster. "My husband and I bought our house last year." Barbara smiled politely. "Welcome again to Maple Ridge." Emily ignored the greeting. "Our realtor advertised lakefront living. Our mortgage reflects lakefront value. If the lake depends on the dam, shouldn't we understand how the dam is maintained?" Several homeowners quietly nodded. Barbara noticed. For the first time since becoming HOA president, the room wasn't following her automatically. People weren't challenging her authority. They were asking for information. There was a difference, a very important difference. Barbara took a slow breath. "The board has always acted in the community's best interests." Frank Delaney spoke again. "I'm sure you believed that." The room fell silent. But believing something and documenting it aren't always the same. Barbara looked toward him. "What are you suggesting?" Frank shrugged. "I'm suggesting transparency." Those two words spread through the room almost instantly. Transparency. Not blame, not lawsuits. Transparency. One homeowner after another began asking similar questions. Can residents read the inspection reports? Has the board received engineering advice before? Who determines maintenance schedules? What exactly does the county recommend? The meeting slowly transformed. No one shouted, no one argued. The questions simply became more specific, and specific questions were much harder to avoid than emotional accusations. Meanwhile, Garrett unlocked the control house beside the dam once again. The familiar smell of steel and lubricating oil greeted him. Everything looked exactly as it had yesterday, exactly as it had for years. He walked directly toward the large outlet valve, not to operate it, to inspect it. He slowly rotated the hand wheel several degrees, just enough to confirm free movement, then returned it to its original position. Routine maintenance, nothing more. He recorded the test in the maintenance log, date, time, observations, signature. His grandfather had followed the exact same procedure hundreds of times. Good engineers documented ordinary days because extraordinary days often depended on them. As Garrett closed the logbook, he noticed something tucked underneath it. A folded envelope, old, yellowed, addressed in Walter Hollis's handwriting. For whoever maintains this dam after me, Garrett stared at it. He had organized this room dozens of times. How had he never seen it? He carefully unfolded the letter. Inside was only one handwritten page. Walter's familiar script filled every line. If you're reading this, it means the dam has outlived me. Garrett smiled faintly, then continued reading. You will eventually meet people who believe water is permanent. Don't argue with them. Show them records. People change their minds much faster when evidence reaches them before emotion does. Garrett quietly lowered the page. His grandfather hadn't left instructions for operating machinery. He had left instructions for dealing with people. Just then, another truck pulled onto the gravel road. This one didn't belong to the county or the media. The side door displayed the logo of one of the state's largest engineering consulting firms. Garrett frowned. A man in a gray polo shirt stepped out carrying a hard case. He walked toward Garrett and extended his hand. Mr. Hollis? Yes. My name is Michael Lawson. I've been hired by the Maple Ridge HOA. Garrett nodded politely. I assumed they eventually would. Michael smiled. They've asked us to perform an independent engineering assessment. Garrett wasn't surprised. Good. Independent verification was exactly what the situation needed. Then Michael added one sentence that immediately changed Garrett's expectations. But before we begin, there's something I think you should know. Garrett waited. Michael looked back toward the lake. The board didn't hire us to prove you wrong. He paused. They hired us because... Their attorney has questions about documents from 1990. Garrett felt the pieces beginning to move, not because anyone had admitted fault, but because, for the first time, the board wasn't asking engineers to defend a position. They were asking engineers to find the truth. Michael Lawson didn't reach for the engineering drawings. He didn't ask for the inspection reports. He didn't even look toward the spillway. Instead, he looked directly at Garrett. I'd like to ask you a question before we inspect anything. Garrett nodded. Go ahead. Michael adjusted the strap of the equipment case on his shoulder. If the HOA agreed to pay every dollar tomorrow, would you still repair the dam? Garrett answered without hesitation. Yes. Michael studied him for a moment. No delay? No. No negotiation? No. Michael smiled almost imperceptibly. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Garrett raised an eyebrow. You were hoping? Michael nodded. I've been doing forensic engineering for 26 years. I've testified in more lawsuits than I care to remember. He glanced toward the lake. People usually become more interested in winning the argument than solving the problem. He looked back at Garrett. You don't seem interested in winning, Garrett answered quietly. I'm interested in making sure this dam is still here 20 years from now. Michael extended his hand again. Then I think we'll work well together. They began at the downstream embankment. No cameras, no reporters, only instruments. Laser levels, ground-penetrating radar, moisture probes, ultrasonic scanners. Every measurement was recorded twice, every observation photographed, every conclusion left blank until the evidence could speak. Michael insisted on one rule, no assumptions. Garrett appreciated that immediately. Around mid-morning, Michael crouched beside one of the larger cracks in the spillway. He ran a thin gauge into the opening, measured, photographed, measured again, then quietly wrote something in his notebook. Garrett didn't ask what. Good engineers never interrupted another engineer's observations. 2 hours later, Michael stood inside the control house examining the outlet valve. His fingers traced the worn manufacturer's plate, March 1964. Garrett nodded. My grandfather installed it. Michael looked impressed. It's still operational? Garrett opened the maintenance log. It was exercised 3 days ago. Michael slowly turned several pages, then another, then another. The entries stretched back decades. Every inspection, every lubrication, every operational test. Signed, dated, documented. Michael looked up. I've seen maintenance records this complete. Garrett smiled faintly. My grandfather believed memories fail. Paper doesn't. Michael closed the logbook carefully. I wish every infrastructure owner thought that way. By early afternoon, the two engineers sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree overlooking the lake. Neither had spoken much all day. Now Michael finally broke the silence. Can I ask you something personal? Garrett nodded. You've owned this dam for 6 months. Yes. You could sell the property. I could. You could walk away. I could. Michael frowned. So why haven't you? Garrett looked across the calm water. My grandfather spent 3 years building something that protected this valley. He paused. I inherited concrete, but I also inherited his word. Michael didn't reply. Some answers didn't need further discussion. At that exact moment, Barbara's white Escalade rolled slowly down the gravel road. She stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. Unlike previous meetings, she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was attorney Rebecca Sloan, mid-50s, calm, measured, the kind of lawyer who spoke very little, because she expected every word to matter. Rebecca approached first. Mr. Hollis, Garrett nodded politely. Miss Sloan. Michael looked surprised. You know each other? Rebecca smiled. We've testified in the same courtroom twice. Michael laughed. On opposite sides, Rebecca nodded. Both times. And we both lost. Garrett looked confused, Rebecca explained. The judge followed the engineering. Michael laughed again. That sounds familiar. Barbara waited until the introductions ended, then spoke directly to Garrett. Our board retained Ms. Sloan after reviewing several historical documents. Garrett didn't mention the warehouse. He simply listened. Barbara continued. We're conducting an internal review. Garrett nodded once. I think that's wise. Barbara seemed almost surprised that he hadn't challenged her. For weeks she had expected confrontation. Instead, she found cooperation. It unsettled her. Rebecca opened her portfolio. I have a question. Garrett waited. Were you aware of a legal memorandum dated 1990? Garrett answered honestly. I became aware of it recently. Rebecca studied his face. Did you provide it to the media? No. Did you release it publicly? No, Barbara interrupted. Then how did reporters hear about it? Garrett looked at her calmly. I don't know. The answer frustrated her. Because it sounded true. Michael stood. If I may, everyone turned toward him. I'm not here as anyone's advocate. I'm here as an independent engineer. Rebecca nodded. Of course, Michael continued. I've completed approximately 70% of today's assessment. Barbara folded her arms. And Michael chose his words carefully. The structure is repairable. A visible wave of relief crossed Barbara's face. Then Michael added, but delaying those repairs would be professionally irresponsible, sir. The relief disappeared. Nobody spoke. Michael wasn't finished. The disagreement I've observed isn't primarily technical. He looked first at Garrett, then at Barbara. It's administrative. The engineering has been remarkably consistent for decades. Barbara frowned. What does that mean? Michael answered simply. It means the concrete has been telling the same story for years. The people have been arguing about who should cushion. Rebecca Sloan slowly closed her portfolio. That single sentence changed the entire discussion, because it separated two questions everyone had been treating as one. Question 1. What condition is the dam in? The engineers agreed. Question 2. Who bears what responsibility? That remained unresolved. For the first time, the conflict became clearer, not larger, clearer. As Barbara prepared to leave, she hesitated, then turned back toward Garrett. I owe you something. Garrett waited. She took a slow breath. When you first came to the board, I believed you were trying to shift your personal expenses onto the community. Garrett remained silent. Barbara continued. I'm no longer certain that was your intention. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was the first crack in a belief she'd defended for weeks. That evening, Garrett returned to the small office beside the dam. The room felt strangely quiet after the day's conversations. He placed Michael's preliminary notes beside his grandfather's journals, then opened the old maintenance ledger once more. A folded newspaper clipping slipped from between 2 pages. He almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, he unfolded it. The article was dated August 12, 1965. Its headline read, "Local Farmers Dam Saves Town During Wrecker Storm." Garrett read the first paragraph. Heavy rainfall had caused severe flooding downstream. According to the article, Walter Hollis had manually operated the outlet system throughout the night, reducing pressure on the structure and helping prevent catastrophic flooding. At the bottom of the clipping, someone had written in blue ink, Walter's handwriting. "One day people will remember the lake. They'll forget the flood that happened." Garrett slowly folded the article. His grandfather had understood something profound. Success in engineering often looked invisible. When infrastructure worked, history quietly forgot why. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the western horizon. The forecast predicted 3 consecutive days of heavy rain. Inside the office, Garrett looked toward the control house where the 60-year-old valve rested in silence. The storm wasn't the problem. The dam wasn't the problem. The real question was whether decades of delayed decisions were about to collide with nature's schedule, and nature never postponed its deadlines. The rain began just after midnight, not with thunder, not with lightning, just a slow, steady rhythm against rooftops and windows. Most people in Maple Ridge slept through it. Garrett didn't. He had spent enough years around reservoirs to know that the first hour of rain rarely mattered. The third day did. He stood in the control house, overlooking the spillway, a steaming mug of black coffee resting beside an open rainfall chart. Every 15 minutes, he wrote down 3 numbers: rainfall, reservoir elevation, outflow. Nothing dramatic, just data. Engineers trusted trends long before they trusted instincts. By 6 o'clock that morning, Daniel Pierce pulled into the gravel parking area. He stepped out carrying another clipboard.
"You've been here all night?"
Garrett nodded. "I wanted a baseline before the storm intensified." Daniel glanced toward the reservoir. The National Weather Service updated the forecast. How much? 6 to 8 inches. Garrett looked back at the lake. "That's significant." Daniel corrected him. "For most lakes," he pointed toward the dam. "For this one, it's a management problem." The 2 engineers walked slowly along the crest of the dam. Water remained nearly 2 feet below the emergency spillway. Comfortable. Safe. Exactly where it should be. Daniel crouched beside one of the survey markers they had installed 2 days earlier. He compared its elevation with the digital level. No measurable movement. Good. Very good. But neither man smiled. They both knew something the residents didn't. Concrete rarely failed because of a single storm. It failed because years of neglected maintenance eventually met a storm. By mid-morning, the first television helicopter circled above the lake. Its blades echoed across the valley. Reporters loved dramatic pictures. Rain, water, expensive homes. It looked like a disaster waiting to happen. The problem was, there wasn't one. Not yet. Garrett's phone rang. Melissa Carter again. Channel 7 News. He answered this time. "Mr. Hollis, residents are worried." "I understand. Can you tell viewers whether the dam is safe?" Garrett answered carefully. "The dam is being monitored continuously. Is there immediate danger?" "No." "Then why are county engineers here?" "Because responsible infrastructure is monitored before emergencies occur." Melissa paused. "Can I quote that?" "You already did." Within an hour, local television stations repeated the sentence almost verbatim. Responsible infrastructure is monitored before emergencies occur. It wasn't sensational. It wasn't frightening. It was simply true. Ironically, that made it more powerful than speculation. Meanwhile, inside the HOA clubhouse, Barbara watched the broadcasts on a mounted television. She noticed something immediately. No reporter described Garrett as reckless. No county official contradicted him. Every interview focused on inspections, documentation, preparedness. The narrative was changing. Slowly, but unmistakably. Rebecca Sloan entered carrying another stack of documents. "I've reviewed the 1990 legal opinion." Barbara looked up, and Rebecca placed the folder on the table. "I've also reviewed every board minute since then." Barbara waited. Rebecca chose her words carefully. "I think previous boards misunderstood the advice." Barbara frowned. "Misunderstood?" Rebecca nodded. "They focused on ownership. They stopped discussing cooperation." Barbara stared silently at the table. The distance suddenly seemed enormous. Across town, Michael Lawson completed his independent engineering report. His office remained almost unnaturally quiet. No music. No phone calls. Only the sound of pages turning. He reviewed every photograph, every measurement, every historical inspection. Then opened a blank page titled, Professional Opinion. He sat there for nearly 5 minutes before writing the first sentence. Because good engineering reports didn't begin with conclusions. They began with certainty. That afternoon, the rain intensified. Small streams feeding the reservoir turned brown with runoff. The lake rose 3 inches, then 4. Still well within normal operating limits, Daniel updated the monitoring chart. No surprises. Garrett nodded. That's exactly what we want. Just after 4 o'clock, an elderly pickup truck pulled onto the access road. Frank Delaney stepped out. He carried no umbrella despite the rain, only a cardboard box. I thought you might want these. Garrett accepted it. What's inside? Frank smiled. My garage. Inside the box were dozens of old neighborhood newsletters dating back more than 25 years. Community picnics, fishing tournaments, holiday boat parades. Garrett flipped through them casually, then stopped. One issue from 1998 featured a full-page article. Thank you to Walter Hollis for another year of keeping our lake beautiful. Beneath the headline, photographs showed HOA board members presenting Walter with a plaque. Garrett looked up. Frank chuckled. Funny, isn't it? What is? For years, everyone knew the lake depended on him. He shrugged. Somewhere along the way, people started believing it maintained itself. Garrett carefully set the newsletter aside. It wasn't legally important, but it was historically important. Communities often forgot gradually, not all at once. As evening approached, Daniel received a call from the county weather office. He listened without interrupting, then slowly lowered the phone. What happened? Garrett asked. Daniel looked toward the dark clouds gathering beyond the hills. They've upgraded tomorrow's rainfall forecast. Garrett waited. How much? Daniel answered quietly. Enough that we need to review the emergency operating plan. The words hung in the air. Neither engineer panicked. Reviewing an emergency procedure didn't mean using it. Pilots reviewed emergency checklists before every flight. Firefighters inspected equipment before every shift. Preparation wasn't panic. It was professionalism. The two men entered the control house. Daniel opened the county manual. Garrett unlocked his grandfather's maintenance cabinet. Both documents arrived at the same page almost simultaneously. Emergency drawdown procedures. Daniel smiled faintly. Looks like Walter organized his files the same way the county does. Garrett returned the smile. He probably taught them. They reviewed each step aloud. Valve inspection, communication protocol, downstream notification, water level targets. Everything matched. Everything had been tested. Everything except one thing. Daniel reached the final page. Public notification. He looked at Garrett. If this procedure ever becomes necessary, the HOA must be informed immediately. Garrett nodded. Of course. Daniel closed the manual. I don't think Barbara understands what this document actually means. Garrett looked toward the silent steel valve in the center of the room. No, he said quietly. I don't think she does either. Outside. The rain continued to fall, steady, patient, uninterested in politics, uninterested in board meetings, uninterested in legal arguments. Water never negotiated. It simply obeyed gravity, and gravity always kept its appointments. The rain stopped just before dawn, not because the storm had ended, only because the first system had moved north. Another front was already forming hundreds of miles away. Daniel Pierce watched the latest radar images inside the County Emergency Operations Center. He wasn't interested in dramatic colors on a weather map. He was watching numbers. Rainfall totals, soil saturation, reservoir inflow, downstream discharge. Weather created headlines. Hydrology created consequences. Garrett was already standing on the crest of the dam when Daniel arrived. The lake had risen another 6 inches overnight, still safe, still below every operational threshold. But the margin was shrinking. Daniel looked across the reservoir. The forecast changed again. Garrett didn't look away from the water. Worse? Daniel nodded. Not catastrophic, but enough that we can't rely on yesterday's assumptions. Garrett quietly marked another measurement inside the maintenance log. Neither can concrete. For nearly 10 minutes, the two engineers walked the entire length of the dam. No cracks had widened, no seepage had increased. Instrumentation remained stable. The structure was performing exactly as expected. Ironically, that worried Garrett, because a well-maintained structure deserved equally well-maintained decisions. Instead, the engineering had remained consistent. Only the people had changed. At exactly 9:15 a.m., Garrett's phone rang. Barbara. The first time she had called him directly, he answered immediately. "Good morning." There was a brief pause before she spoke. "Can we meet?" Garrett looked toward Daniel. "When?" "Now." 30 minutes later, they sat across from one another inside the empty clubhouse. No reporters, no board members, no attorneys. Just two people who had spent weeks arguing through meetings and documents instead of conversations. Barbara placed a thick binder on the table. "I've been reading." Garrett nodded. "I can see that." She opened the binder. Inside were photocopies of nearly every document Garrett had uncovered. The 1990 legal opinion, the engineering memorandum, Walter Hollis's correspondence, county planning minutes. Rebecca Sloan had organized everything with colored tabs. Barbara rested her hand on the first page. "I owe you something." Garrett remained silent. She wasn't finished.
When you first came, I thought you wanted money.
Garrett nodded once. "I know. I believed you were using fear." Another nod. "I know." Barbara looked down. "I never actually questioned the engineering." She paused. "I questioned you." Garrett considered her words carefully. "Why?" Barbara answered honestly. "Because I thought that was easier." Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, reflective. Finally, Garrett spoke.
"My grandfather used to say."
Barbara looked up. "People rarely reject facts. They reject the person delivering them." Barbara smiled faintly. "That sounds painfully accurate." She slid another document across the table. Michael Lawson's completed independent assessment. Garrett opened it. The first page carried one sentence in bold. "The engineering findings of prior inspections are substantially supported by current fields of observations." He continued reading. Every major conclusion aligned with Daniel's reports, with Garrett's consultant, with decades of inspections. Different engineers, different decades. Same conclusions. The evidence had become impossible to dismiss. Barbara folded her hands. "The board meets tonight." Garrett nodded. "I assumed you would. We're considering funding participation." Garrett looked at her. "Participation?" She sighed. "We have fiduciary obligations. We need a legal framework." Garrett understood. Communities couldn't simply write checks because emotions changed. There had to be policy, documentation, procedure, the same things engineers relied upon. "I don't want charity," Garrett said quietly. Barbara looked surprised. "I never did. I want responsibility to match reality." Barbara lowered her eyes. "I think I finally understand the difference." At that moment, Rebecca Sloan entered the room carrying another folder. "I've drafted several options." She placed them on the table. "A voluntary cost-sharing agreement, a long-term infrastructure partnership, and an annual inspection program jointly reviewed by both parties." Garrett read the summaries. No admissions of fault, no accusations, only governance. Exactly what should have existed years earlier. Rebecca looked toward Barbara. "I also have one recommendation." Barbara nodded. "Go ahead. The board should make every historical engineering document available to residents." Barbara hesitated. "Everything?" Rebecca answered firmly. "Everything. If people are expected to trust leadership, they deserve access to the facts." Barbara slowly nodded. "I agree." It was perhaps the most important decision she had made since becoming HOA president. Not because it solved the dam, because it rebuilt trust. That evening, the clubhouse filled again, but this meeting felt different. There were no television cameras inside, only residents, some anxious, some skeptical, some simply curious. Barbara stood behind the podium. She didn't begin with reassurance. She began with an admission. For several weeks, our board has focused on one question: who owns the dam? She paused. That was incomplete. The room became silent. The better question is, how do we responsibly preserve the infrastructure that benefits our entire community? Garrett, seated quietly in the back row, noticed something remarkable. No one interrupted, not because everyone agreed, because everyone was listening. Barbara continued. "We asked independent engineers. We consulted legal counsel. We reviewed historical county records." She lifted Michael Lawson's report. "The engineering has been consistent for decades." She placed it back on the podium. "Our understanding has not." The residents exchanged glances. No applause, no criticism, only attention. Frank Delaney slowly stood. "So," he asked, "what happens now?" Barbara smiled. "For the first time, we stop arguing about yesterday and begin planning for tomorrow." The room remained quiet for a moment. Then, from somewhere near the back, someone began clapping. One person, then another. Soon, nearly the entire room joined in. Not because anyone had won, because for the first time, the community was moving in the same direction. Garrett did not clap. He simply looked out the clubhouse window toward the lake. The water reflected the evening sky exactly as it had the day his grandfather first closed the dam's gates 60 years earlier. Concrete, steel, water. None of them cared about pride. None of them cared about politics. They only responded to responsibility. Outside, another weather alert appeared on Garrett's phone. A second storm system had accelerated. It would arrive nearly 12 hours earlier than forecast. Garrett looked at the notification once, then toward the lake. The board had finally started making the right decisions. Now they would discover whether those decisions had come in time. The alert arrived at 7:14 p.m., not on television, not on social media. It appeared on the secure shared the National Weather Service and the County Emergency Operations Center. Daniel Pierce read it twice before forwarding it to Garrett. Updated forecast expected rainfall increased by 38%. Peak inflow moved forward by 11 hours, nothing else. No dramatic language, no warning in bold red letters, just revised numbers. For an engineer, that was enough. Garrett was still sitting quietly in the last row of the clubhouse when his phone vibrated. He looked down. Daniel had added only 4 words beneath the forecast. "Call me immediately." Garrett quietly stood and slipped outside before anyone noticed. The applause inside the building was still fading as he answered. What changed? Daniel didn't waste a second. The second storm accelerated. How much time? Less than 4 hours. Garrett looked toward the lake. An inflow? Higher than yesterday's worst-case estimate. Garrett didn't respond immediately. Instead, he mentally replayed every measurement collected over the past week. Water level. Reservoir storage. Discharge capacity. Available freeboard. Nothing was unsafe. Yet. But engineering wasn't about reacting to yet. It was about staying ahead of it. "I'll meet you at the dam," Daniel answered. "I'm already driving." By the time Garrett reached the control house, county vehicles were already parked along the gravel access road. No flashing lights, no emergency sirens, just professionals quietly unloading equipment. Michael Lawson was there too. "So is Rebecca?" Garrett asked. Daniel nodded. She insisted. A black SUV rolled to a stop moments later. Rebecca Sloan stepped out carrying a waterproof document case. Barbara followed close behind. She looked around at the gathering engineers. "This isn't an emergency," she said carefully. Daniel answered just as carefully. "No, it's preparation." Inside the control house, the room felt smaller than usual. Not because of fear, because of the number of people. Engineering drawings covered the workbench. Weather projections filled one wall. Historical reservoir curves lay beside current measurements. Michael spread a large topographic map across the table. "Let's review facts." No one objected. Facts were why they had come. Daniel pointed to the first chart, current reservoir elevation, comfortably below the emergency spillway. Michael nodded, structural movement, within expected tolerance, citizens. Garrett added, outlet valve, fully operational, maintained, recently exercised. Rebecca looked around the room. "So why are we here?" Daniel answered with one sentence. "Because good decisions are made before they're required." Barbara listened without interrupting. For the first time since becoming HOA president, she wasn't trying to lead the conversation. She was trying to understand it. Michael placed 2 rainfall graphs side by side. "This," he said, pointing to the first, "was yesterday." Then he pointed to the second. "This is tonight." Barbara frowned. "They don't look very different." Michael smiled politely. "They don't." He reached for a calculator. "The difference is only 38%. Barbara looked relieved. "Only?" Garrett quietly turned the calculator toward her. The new runoff estimate appeared on the screen. Because watersheds were nonlinear, a 38% increase in rainfall produced nearly double the inflow during peak hours. Barbara stared at the numbers. "Oh, nobody said anything. They didn't need to." She understood. Michael folded his arms. "This is why engineers dislike percentages without context." Daniel placed another sheet on the table. If forecasts remain accurate, he said, we should consider a controlled reduction in lake level before the second storm arrives. Silence, not disagreement. Recognition. Everyone in the room knew exactly what that meant. Barbara was the first to speak. You mean the valve? Garrett nodded once. The primary outlet. Rebecca looked toward Daniel. Is that legally permissible? Daniel answered immediately. If justified by engineering. He paused and documented. Barbara slowly walked toward the window overlooking the lake. Families were still walking along the shoreline. Children were throwing bread to ducks. A young couple was taking engagement photos near the water. Everything looked normal. She turned back. If we lower the lake, people will panic. Garrett answered gently. Not if we explain why. Barbara looked unconvinced. You've seen social media. Michael smiled. I have, fortunately. He tapped the engineering reports. Water doesn't read Facebook. A few quiet laughs broke the tension. Even Barbara smiled. Briefly, Rebecca opened her document case. I've already drafted a public information notice. Everyone looked at her. I wasn't sure we'd need it. She shrugged. I prefer being early. Garrett nodded approvingly. Preparedness. Again, the notice contained no alarming language, no sensational warnings, only facts. The county and independent engineers are monitoring reservoir conditions. As part of routine flood management planning, a temporary adjustment in lake level may be considered if weather conditions require. This action is preventative and intended to increase safety margins. Barbara read it twice, then looked up. This sounds calm, Rebecca smiled, because panic is rarely caused by information, it's caused by the absence of it. For nearly an hour, the group reviewed every possible scenario. If rainfall decreased, no action. If forecast remained unchanged, continue monitoring. If inflow exceeded established thresholds, initiate controlled drawdown according to the county-approved emergency action plan. Every decision had a trigger. Every trigger had documentation. Every document referenced engineering, not opinion. As the meeting ended, Daniel quietly closed the emergency manual. I hope we never touch that valve. Garrett looked toward the control pedestal standing silently in the center of the room. So do I, Michael added, but hoping has never been an engineering strategy. Outside, Barbara lingered beside her SUV. She watched Garrett lock the control house. Can I ask you something? Garrett turned. When you first walked into our board meeting, did you already know all of this? Garrett thought for a moment. No. Barbara looked surprised. I only knew one thing. What? He looked across the dark lake, reflecting the first stars of the evening. My grandfather taught me that when something important doesn't make sense, you don't argue. You keep looking until it does. Barbara slowly nodded, then drove away. Garrett remained standing beside the dam long after the headlights disappeared. The night was unusually still, almost peaceful. He placed one hand against the cool steel housing protecting the outlet controls. The same place where Walter Hollis had once stood during storms decades earlier. He remembered the old newspaper clipping. People will remember the lake. They'll forget the flood that never happened. Garrett finally understood what his grandfather had meant. The greatest success in engineering was often invisible. If everything went well over the next 48 hours, no one would ever know how close the community had come to making the wrong decision. His phone vibrated one last time before midnight. A new hydrology model had finished processing. Garrett opened the file. His eyes stopped on a single line. Estimated peak inflow. 7:50 a.m., then another. Controlled drawdown should begin no later than 5:30 a.m. if threshold conditions are reached. He slowly locked the screen. The argument was over. The calculations were about to begin. Garrett arrived at the dam at 4:47 a.m. The sky was still black. No sunrise, no birds, only the soft sound of rain striking the surface of the reservoir. He unlocked the control house without turning on the overhead lights. He didn't need them. He had walked this room hundreds of times. His grandfather had walked it thousands. Every wrench hung exactly where Walter had left it. Every maintenance log occupied the same shelf. Every emergency procedure remained laminated inside a weatherproof binder. Some people called it old-fashioned. Garrett called it reliable. 5 minutes later, Daniel Pierce entered carrying a rugged laptop connected to the county's live hydrology network. Neither man spoke immediately. They both looked at the monitor. Reservoir elevation, inflows, rainfall intensity, downstream river stage, every graph updated automatically every 60 seconds. Daniel finally broke the silence. We're approaching the first trigger. Garrett nodded.
I see it.
Neither reached for the valve, not yet. Outside, rain continued falling with remarkable consistency. Not violent, not dramatic, steady. The kind of rainfall that rarely frightened anyone. The dangerous storms weren't always the loudest. Sometimes they were simply patient. At 5:08 a.m., Michael Lawson arrived. He carried his own laptop, his own calculations, his own conclusions. He compared his numbers against Daniel's. Every graph matched, every forecast agreed. Independent verification, exactly as engineering demanded. Rebecca Sloan entered moments later. She placed a single folder on the table. Inside were signed emergency notification forms, prepared, dated, ready. If we cross the threshold, she said quietly, these go out immediately. Garrett nodded. Preparation, and again. At 5:19 a.m. Barbara walked into the control house. She looked exhausted. She had barely slept, not because she feared the dam, because she feared making the wrong decision. She looked around the room. 4 professionals, 4 independent sets of documents. 4 people reaching the same conclusion without discussing opinions. For the first time, she truly understood what consensus looked like. It wasn't an agreement. It was evidence arriving at the same destination. Daniel looked up from the monitor. Current elevation? Garrett answered. 1.8 inches below operational threshold. Mike checked his own model. I have 1.7. Daniel smiled. Close enough. No one cared whose software predicted the exact number. They cared that every model pointed in the same direction. The room became quiet again. Outside, water continued arriving. One creek, then another. Thousands of tiny streams across the watershed. None of them looked dangerous by themselves. Together, they were mathematics. At 5:27 a.m., the monitor beeped once. Not loudly, just enough to announce something had changed. Daniel looked down. Threshold reached. Nobody moved. Garrett checked the manual. Michael checked his calculations. Rebecca checked the notification order. Barbara watched all 4. Nobody rushed. Nobody panicked. Nobody guessed. Daniel finally spoke. Engineering recommendation? Michael answered first. Controlled drawdown. Garrett nodded. I concur. Daniel looked toward Barbara. The county supports that recommendation. Rebecca added quietly. The procedure complies with state regulations. Every voice in the room had arrived at the same answer. Barbara looked toward Garrett. This is the valve. He nodded. The same one. She walked closer. It looked surprisingly ordinary. No flashing lights, no giant machinery, just 60-year-old steel, a hand wheel, and decades of maintenance. Barbara whispered almost to herself, I thought this thing represented power. Garrett shook his head gently. It represents responsibility. He opened the maintenance log. The final entry. 3 days earlier. Valve exercised. Operational. Normal. Signed, Garrett Hollis. He placed the pen beside the book, wrote one more line. Controlled drawdown initiated in accordance with emergency action plan. Time, 5:31 a.m., then signed his name. Only then. Did he place both hands on the wheel? The room remained perfectly silent. Nobody reached for a camera. Nobody spoke. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't victory. It was engineering. Garrett's row slowly rotated the wheel. One turn. Then another. Steel groaned softly. Water began moving through the outlet conduit deep beneath the dam, not explosively, almost gently, like the structure itself understood its purpose. Daniel watched the downstream flow monitor, discharge increasing. Michael checked the reservoir model, exactly as predicted. Garrett continued opening the valve in small, controlled increments, never too quickly, never too slowly. Every movement matched the procedure, every adjustment documented. Every action witnessed. Outside, nothing dramatic happened. The lake didn't disappear. Boats didn't crash into mud. Docks remained floating. The water simply began falling a fraction of an inch each hour, barely noticeable. Exactly as designed. Rebecca sent the first notification. County officials, emergency management, environmental agencies. Then the Maple Ridge HOA. Barbara stopped her. I'll do that one. Rebecca handed her the phone. Barbara hesitated for only a second before pressing send. Within minutes, residents began receiving the message. Temporary lake level adjustment underway as part of the county-approved flood management procedure. The action is preventive and follows engineering recommendations. There is no immediate danger to residents. Updates will continue throughout the day. No dramatic language, no hidden information, just facts. At 6:04 a.m. The first residents arrived, not angry, curious. Frank Delaney stood quietly near the security barrier watching water leave the outlet channel. Emily Foster joined him. "So," she asked, "this is what everyone was arguing about." Frank smiled sadly. "No, this is what everyone should have been talking about." By 7 o'clock, the television crews had returned. Melissa Carter stood beside the community entrance. She wasn't reporting a disaster. She was reporting preparation. Behind her, the lower lake looked almost identical to yesterday. Only engineers could see the difference. The extra storage, the increased safety margin, the invisible buffer now waiting for the approaching storm. Melissa finished her report with a sentence that surprised even Garrett. "The most important story today isn't that officials opened a 60-year-old valve. It's that they did so before anyone was in danger." Garrett quietly smiled. For once, the headline matched the truth. At 10:42 a.m., the second storm arrived. Harder, heavier, exactly as forecast. Rain hammered the watershed. Streams surged. Runoff accelerated. The reservoir began rising again. Only this time, it had somewhere to go. The space created during the previous 2 hours quietly absorbed the incoming water. No emergency, no panic, no headlines, just physics, working exactly as intended. Daniel looked at the latest graph, peak inflow, then reservoir elevation, still below every critical threshold. He slowly exhaled. It worked. Michael nodded. The plan worked. Garrett corrected them gently. No. He looked toward the aging dam beyond the rain-streaked window. The preparation worked. Outside, families remained safely inside their homes. Children watched cartoons. Coffee brewed in kitchens. Life continued almost normally. Most residents would never realize how important 2 hours had been. And that, Garrett thought, was exactly how good infrastructure should work. The rain ended just before noon. Not with a dramatic clearing of the sky. Not with sunlight breaking through dark clouds. It simply stopped for several long minutes. No one inside the control house said anything. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the live reservoir graph. The inflow curve had peaked. The lake continued rising, but more slowly now. Daniel refreshed the data again, then one final time. He quietly leaned back. "We've passed it." Garrett looked up. The peak? Daniel nodded once. "The watershed has given us everything it had." Nobody celebrated. Engineers rarely did. They had learned long ago that victory wasn't announced. It was confirmed. Michael compared the live readings with yesterday's forecast. They're almost identical. Garrett glanced at the outlet flow monitor. The drawdown created just enough storage. Rebecca slowly closed the emergency procedures binder. So the plan worked. Garrett looked toward the lake through the rain-speckled window. The plan wasn't designed to succeed. He paused. It was designed to prevent failure. Outside, Maple Ridge looked almost unchanged. The docks floated peacefully. Kayaks remained tied to their slips. Children were already returning to the walking trail as the clouds drifted east. To most residents, nothing unusual had happened, exactly as Garrett had hoped. By early afternoon, county inspectors completed another structural survey. No measurable settlement, no increase in seepage, no concrete movement beyond expected tolerances. Daniel signed the field report. Structure performed within anticipated limits during storm event. One sentence. Months of preparation reduced to 10 words. Meanwhile, something entirely different was happening online. Residents had begun posting side-by-side photographs of the lake. One picture from the previous day, one from that morning. Most people couldn't even tell the difference. Comments quickly appeared. "That's it? I thought they were draining the whole lake." The news made it sound much worse. "Looks completely normal." The narrative shifted by the hour. Fear was being replaced by curiosity. At Channel 7 News, Melissa Carter reviewed footage from the previous 48 hours. She watched Garrett refusing to speculate. She watched county engineers quietly collecting measurements. She watched Barbara's first public meeting and then her second. Something didn't fit the story she'd expected. There had been no confrontation, no reckless act, no dramatic showdown, only documents, measurements, and preparation. She turned to her producer. "I think we've been covering the wrong story." He looked up from his laptop. "What do you mean?" Melissa pointed toward the screen. "Everyone keeps asking whether the dam was dangerous." She shook her head. "That's not the real question." That evening, her station aired a new report, not from the lakeshore. From inside the county archives, the camera slowly panned across aging engineering reports, inspectioning records, and plain documents. Melissa spoke directly to viewers. Our investigation found that engineers have been making remarkably consistent recommendations for decades. The debate wasn't over what the reports said. It was over who believed them and when. There was no sensational music, no alarming graphics, just facts. For once, the story itself was enough. Inside the Maple Ridge Community Facebook group, someone uploaded a scanned photograph from 1998. Walter Hollis stood beside the lake, smiling awkwardly as HOA board members handed him a plaque. The caption beneath the photo read, "Thank you for another year of protecting our lake." Within minutes, dozens of comments appeared. "I remember him. My parents talked about Walter all the time." Wait, the HOA used to thank him every year? So everyone knew? No one answered the last question. They didn't need to. Barbara sat alone in her office reading the comments. Not defensive, not angry, reflective. She opened the old board minutes Rebecca had organized. Meeting after meeting, year after year. Budgets. Landscaping. Holiday decorations. Pool repairs. But almost nothing about the infrastructure that made the neighborhood possible. She closed the binder. Leadership, she realized, wasn't only about making decisions. It was about making sure important conversations never disappeared. Her phone rang. It was Frank Delaney. "I'd just watched the news." "So did I," Barbara replied. Frank was quiet for a moment. "You know what surprised me?" "What?" "They didn't make anyone the villain." Barbara looked toward the lake outside her window. "No, they made forgetting the villain." Across town, Garrett returned to the control house one last time before sunset. The outlet valve had already been adjusted back toward its normal operating position as inflows declined. He completed the final maintenance entry for the storm. Emergency flood management operation concluded. No structural anomalies observed. He signed his name, closed the logbook, and placed it back on the same shelf where his grandfather had kept it for decades. Another storm, another record, another ordinary day that almost hadn't been. As he switched off the lights, Daniel called from outside. "The county commissioners want a meeting next week." Garrett locked the steel door. "About the dam?" Daniel smiled. "No. About every privately owned critical structure in the county." Garrett frowned. "What changed?" Daniel looked back toward the quiet lake. They realized this story isn't unique. He paused. They're wondering how many other communities are depending on infrastructure they barely understand. Garrett stood silently for a moment. The problem had grown larger, not because the dam had failed, but because people had finally begun asking the right question. And sometimes one well-documented story was enough to change an entire system. The county commission chamber had never been this full. Residents from Maple Ridge filled nearly every seat. Some came because they owned lakefront property. Some came because they had watched the story unfold on television. Others came simply because they wanted to understand how one forgotten dam had nearly rewritten an entire community's future. No one came expecting a fight. They came expecting answers. Garrett arrived 15 minutes early, not to prepare a speech. He hadn't written one. Instead, he placed a single cardboard archive box on the witness table. Inside were decades of documents, inspection reports, maintenance logs, engineering recommendations, letters, photographs, nothing highlighted. Nothing rearranged. Evidence spoke best when it remained untouched. Across the room, Barbara entered carrying only one folder. She noticed Garrett's box immediately. Months earlier, she would have seen it as a weapon. Today, she saw it as history. She walked toward him. "I've been thinking." Garrett looked up. "About what?" Barbara glanced around the crowded chamber. "We spent weeks arguing over who should be responsible." She paused. "I never stopped to ask whether responsibility could be shared." Garrett smiled politely. "Most infrastructure survives because it is." At exactly 7 o'clock, Commission Chair Eleanor Brooks called the meeting to order. "This hearing concerns the long-term preservation of privately owned infrastructure providing substantial public benefit." She looked around the room. "This hearing is not a lawsuit. It is not a criminal investigation. It is a public review." Those words immediately lowered the temperature in the room. No one was here to destroy reputations. They were here to understand how decades of reasonable people had slowly inherited an unreasonable system. The first witness was Daniel Pierce. He stood before the commission with no dramatic presentation. Only charts, graphs, measurements. He explained the dam's history, the inspection timeline, the storm, the controlled drawdown. Every conclusion pointed to the same simple reality. The engineering recommendations remained remarkably consistent over several decades. One commissioner leaned forward. So what changed? Daniel answered without hesitation. The reports didn't. The people reading them did. Several residents quietly nodded. Michael Lawson testified next. As an independent engineer, he had no connection to Garrett, no relationship with the HOA, no financial interest in the outcome. That mattered. I independently reviewed every major structural concern identified over the past 30 years. He looked toward the commissioners. I reached substantially the same conclusions. One commissioner asked, "Could this situation have been avoided?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Yes." Not because the dam required extraordinary repairs, but because extraordinary delays turned ordinary maintenance into extraordinary decisions. The room fell silent. That sentence would appear in nearly every newspaper the next morning. Then Rebecca Sloan approached the podium. She carried no engineering drawings, only legal documents. She explained the 1990 memorandum, the distribution list, the decades of changing board memberships. No evidence suggests that any recent board intentionally concealed these records. She paused. Instead, institutional memory gradually disappeared. She looked around the chamber. The sisters assumed that knowledge would naturally pass from one generation of leaders to the next. It didn't. Garrett realized something important. Rebecca wasn't defending anyone. She was defending the truth. There was a difference. Finally, Barbara Kingsley stood. No prepared statement, no attorney beside her. Just a single sheet of paper folded neatly in half. She looked toward the results she had represented for years. Then she looked toward Garrett. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but different. Barbara unfolded the single sheet of paper. Then she folded it again. She looked at the commissioners, then at the residents filling every chair in the room. Finally, she pushed the paper aside. "I'm not going to read this." The room grew noticeably quieter. I spent 3 days writing the perfect statement. A faint smile crossed her face. It sounded professional. It sounded careful. It also sounded dishonest. No one moved. No one interrupted. She continued. "When Garrett first appeared before our board, I believed he wanted us to pay for his property." She looked directly at him. I never asked enough questions to discover that he was trying to protect ours. Garrett remained expressionless. Not because he disagreed, because this moment wasn't about him. It never had been. Barbara slowly turned toward the audience. "I made a mistake. Not legally, not technically, as a leader." She paused long enough for every word to settle. "I assumed that because generations before us had made the same decision, it must have been the correct decision." She shook her head. "I confused tradition with evidence." No one applauded. No one whispered. The room understood the difference between an explanation and an excuse. Barbara wasn't offering excuses. She was accepting responsibility. Commission Chair Eleanor Brooks leaned forward. "Mrs. Kingsley, do you believe the board acted in bad faith?" Barbara answered immediately, "No." "Do you believe the board acted with complete information?" A much longer silence followed. Then she quietly answered, "No." Rebecca Sloan nodded almost imperceptibly. That distinction mattered. Bad faith required intent. Poor governance often required nothing more than incomplete knowledge. Communities weren't usually damaged by villains. They were damaged by assumptions that went unquestioned. Commissioner David Morales adjusted his glasses.
Mr. Hollis?
Garrett stood. "You inherited this dam 6 months ago." "Correct. You could have filed a lawsuit." "I could have." "You could have refused to maintain it." "I could have." "You could have opened the valve without warning years from now after the structure became unsafe." Garrett looked down for a moment before answering. "I legally might have." The commissioner raised an eyebrow. "But?" Garrett met his eyes. "My grandfather didn't leave me permission. He left me responsibility." The room remained silent, not because the answer was dramatic, because it was simple, and simple truths were often the hardest to dismiss. Commissioner Brooks looked toward Daniel Pierce. "Engineer Pierce, if Mr. Hollis had ignored maintenance, what would eventually have happened?" Daniel answered carefully. "The dam would almost certainly have remained standing for quite some time." Several residents looked relieved. Then Daniel continued, But maintenance isn't judged by what happens this year. It's judged by what becomes inevitable 10 years from now. He pointed toward one of the engineering diagrams projected onto the screen. Deferred maintenance compounds. It rarely announces itself. It accumulates quietly until ordinary repairs become extraordinary expenses. Michael Lawson stood beside the projection. I'd like to add something. The commission nodded. He enlarged a chart comparing projected repair costs over 30 years. The first line rose slowly, routine maintenance. Predictable costs. The second line remained flat for years, then climbed almost vertically, deferred maintenance. Emergency intervention. Replacement. Michael looked around the chamber. The difference between these two lines isn't engineering. It's time. Several commissioners exchanged glances. One quietly wrote something in his notebook. Another simply nodded. The graph required no explanation. Everyone understood it. Then Frank Delaney slowly approached the public microphone. He wasn't on the witness list. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't an attorney. He was simply one of the oldest residents in Maple Ridge. I've lived beside that lake for 29 years. He smiled gently. I watched Walter Hollis inspect that dam almost every Sunday morning. He paused. Back then, I thought he was checking on his property. Frank looked toward Garrett. I was wrong. He was checking on ours. For the first time that evening, the room broke into quiet applause. Not loud, not celebratory, respectful. The applause wasn't for Garrett. It wasn't even for Walter. It was for an idea that had taken an entire community decades to rediscover. As the applause faded, Chair Brooks addressed the room once more. I believe today's hearing has answered one question. She paused. But it has created another. Everyone looked toward her. If this community overlooked critical infrastructure for decades, how many other communities have done exactly the same? No one answered, because no one knew. And that uncertainty suddenly felt much larger than Maple Ridge. The hearing adjourned for a 15-minute recess. Residents slowly stood, talking quietly among themselves. For weeks they had expected someone to lose. Instead, they had watched something far more unusual. A community had chosen understanding over blame. But Garrett noticed something else. Near the back of the chamber, a young county planner was speaking urgently with another commissioner while pointing toward a tablet. The commissioner's expression changed instantly. He walked quickly toward Chair Brooks. She read the screen, then looked toward Daniel. Engineer Pierce, I think you need to see this. Daniel walked over. His calm expression disappeared. Not replaced by panic, by concentration. He immediately turned toward Garrett. We may have another problem. Garrett frowned. What kind of problem? Daniel rotated the tablet so only Garrett could see it. It wasn't about Hollis Dam. It was a county infrastructure inventory. One line had been highlighted in red. Private Dam 12 inspection status. Unknown last verified structural assessment. 1994. Garrett looked up slowly. The Maple Ridge story had just uncovered something much bigger. The room emptied more slowly than anyone expected. Residents weren't arguing. They weren't rushing toward reporters. They stood in small groups, quietly discussing engineering reports they had never imagined they would read. For weeks, Maple Ridge had been divided. Now it was thinking. Garrett remained near the witness table, carefully returning every document to the same archive box he had carried into the hearing. He didn't like loose papers. Evidence deserved order. Daniel walked toward him, carrying the county-issued tablet. His expression remained calm. That worried Garrett more than if he had looked alarmed. What is it? Daniel placed the tablet on the table between them. It's not another weather event. Garrett looked down. Then what am I looking at? The county's complete inventory of privately owned water control structures. Rows of data filled the screen. Dams, retention basins, agricultural reservoirs, flood control ponds, each listed with its owner, inspection history, and engineering classification. One entry glowed yellow, another orange. One was red. Garrett pointed to the highlighted record. Private Dam number 12. Daniel nodded. It serves a residential subdivision. When was it last inspected? Daniel zoomed in. The last verified structural assessment was completed. He paused. 32 years ago. Garrett looked up. That's impossible. I thought so too. Michael Lawson joined them. I heard. Daniel turned the tablet toward him. Michael scanned the record, then frowned. No, he whispered. This can't be right. Garrett looked at him. You know this dam? Michael nodded slowly. I inspected it. Garrett blinked. When? Michael looked uncomfortable. About 14 years ago. Daniel frowned. Then why isn't it in the county database? Michael already knew the answer. Because it wasn't a county inspection. It was commissioned privately by the developer. Silence. Garrett crossed his arms. So the county believes the last inspection was 32 years ago. Michael nodded. Because they never received mine. Rafika Sloan stepped closer. Was that required?
Michael thought for a moment.
At the time, no, he sighed. It probably should have been. Garrett stared at the screen. One forgotten legal opinion had nearly changed Maple Ridge forever. Now another discovery suggested the problem wasn't one community. It was an entire system built on fragmented information. Different engineers, different owners, different files.
Nobody saw the complete picture. Commission Chair Eleanor Brooks approached quietly.
I've spoken with the other commissioners. Daniel looked up.
And we're opening a countywide infrastructure review. Not next year.
Not after another committee. Immediately. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. That's ambitious. Chair Brooks smiled faintly. So was believing this problem only existed here. Across the room, Barbara watched the conversation from a distance. She could have gone home. The hearing had ended. Instead, she walked over. I heard the word countywide. Daniel nodded. We found another gap. Barbara looked at the highlighted entry, then slowly exhaled. I spent weeks believing our board was uniquely unprepared. She looked toward Chair Brooks. It sounds like we weren't. No. Brooks answered honestly. You were simply the first community to discover it. At that moment, a county clerk hurried into the chamber carrying an aging storage box. Chair Brooks, I think you asked for an archived infrastructure inventory. Brooks nodded. The clerk placed the box on the table. Dust rose into the air. The label had almost disappeared. Only 3 words remained visible. Private water constructors. Garrett couldn't help but smile. Daniel noticed. What? Garrett looked at the box. I've learned something over the past month. Daniel waited. The most dangerous sentence in local government is probably... He gently brushed dust from the lid. We thought someone else had it. Michael laughed quietly. Rebecca nodded. Barbara didn't, because she knew exactly how true that sentence was. Chair Brooks rested both hands on the old archive box, then addressed everyone still remaining in the chamber. For decades, our county inspected public infrastructure. She looked around the room. Today we learned that public safety doesn't always follow public ownership. Nobody disagreed. We've spent years asking, who owns it? She paused. I think it's time we begin asking, who depends on it? The room became silent once again, because everyone understood the difference. Ownership defined legal boundaries. Dependence defined communities, and communities were always larger than property lines. Outside, reporters waited for dramatic statements. Instead, residents emerged carrying photocopies of engineering reports. Some discussed inspection intervals. Others debated reserve funds. One elderly couple talked about creating a permanent infrastructure committee inside the HOA. The headlines tomorrow would probably mention the hearing. Garrett suspected history would remember something else. Not the arguments, not the storm, but the day ordinary homeowners began asking extraordinary questions, and sometimes that was how real change began. 3 days after the hearing, the rainwater had completely receded. The lake returned to its familiar elevation. Morning sunlight danced across the surface as if nothing unusual had happened. Boats returned, fishermen returned. Children laughed from the public dock. Life had resumed exactly as it always had. Garrett stood alone on the crest of the dam. He watched the water quietly, not because he was admiring the view, because he was remembering a sentence. People will remember the lake. They'll forget the flood that never happened. For the first time, those words no longer sounded poetic. They sounded painfully accurate. A truck pulled onto the gravel road behind him. Frank Delaney stepped carrying a weathered wooden toolbox. I've been cleaning my attic. Garrett smiled. Again? Frank laughed. My wife says I should have done it 20 years ago. He placed the toolbox on the hood of his truck. I found something that belongs to you. Garrett looked inside. Old surveying tools, a brass level, a leather notebook, and one sealed envelope. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, were 6 simple words. For Garrett when he understands. Garrett's heartbeat slowed. The handwriting belonged to only one person, Walter Hollis. I never opened it, Frank said quietly. Your grandfather gave it to me the winter before he passed. Garrett looked up. He's asked you to keep it? Frank nodded. He said. Frank smiled softly as he remembered. Don't give it to the boy when he inherits the dam. Garrett frowned. Then when? Frank looked toward the lake. Give it to him when he stops talking about ownership and starts talking about responsibility. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The only sound came from gentle waves touching the shoreline below. Garrett carefully opened the envelope. Inside, there wasn't a legal document. There wasn't a map. There wasn't even a will. Only 3 handwritten pages folded neatly in half. The paper had yellowed with age. The ink remained perfectly clear. He began reading. Garrett, if you're reading this, then I was right about one thing. The dam finally became your problem. But I hope it didn't become your enemy. Garrett smiled despite himself. That sounded exactly like Walter. People will tell you that I built this dam because I wanted a lake. They are mistaken. The lake was never the reason. Garrett looked toward the still water. His grandfather had never explained why he built it. Not once. I built it because I watched this valley flood 3 times before I turned 30. I watched families lose crops. I watched bridges disappear. I watched children carried through waist-deep water after the 3rd flood. I decided I was finished waiting for someone else to solve the problem. Garrett stopped reading. He had never heard that story. Not from Walter. Not from anyone. By the time the lake filled, people forgot the floods. That was the greatest compliment I ever received. Not because they thanked me. Because they no longer had a reason to remember. Garrett slowly lowered the letter. He looked across the calm reservoir. Families laughed from the marina. A teenager paddled a kayak across the center of the lake. None of them knew. None of them could know. Because Walter had succeeded, he continued reading. Someday, someone will ask who owns this dam. They will ask who should pay. They will ask what the law requires. Those are fair questions. Garrett turned the page. The next sentence had been underlined. They are simply not the first questions. The first question is always this. Who sleeps safely tonight because this structure exists? Garrett closed his eyes. The hearing, the storm. Barbara, Daniel, Michael, the children playing beside the lake. Everything suddenly aligned into one simple idea. His grandfather had never thought like a property owner. He had always thought like a steward. Frank quietly asked, "What did he say?" Garrett folded the letter carefully. He answered every question we've been arguing about. Frank smiled. I figured he might. At that moment, Daniel's truck appeared at the end of the road. He stepped out holding a folder. The county approved it. Garrett looked up. Approved what? Daniel handed him the document. County Infrastructure Stewardship Initiative, a new county policy. Annual engineering reviews. Shared digital records. Mandatory transfer of maintenance history when ownership changed. Public access to non-sensitive inspection reports. Cross-agency documentation. Exactly the failures Maple Ridge had exposed. Exactly the lessons Walter had spent a lifetime practicing, without ever calling it a policy. Daniel looked toward the lake. You know, if your grandfather were alive, Garrett interrupted gently, I don't think he'd care about seeing his name in the policy. Daniel smiled. No. I think he'd ask whether it works. Garrett laughed quietly. That's exactly what he'd ask. The afternoon breeze carried small ripples across the water. The lake looked beautiful. But Garrett finally understood something. The lake was never the achievement. The achievement was everything people no longer feared because it existed. And perhaps that was the quietest kind of legacy anyone could ever leave. 1 year later, the first thing visitors noticed wasn't the dam. It was the lake. Children chased one another along the shoreline. Kayaks drifted lazily across the water. Fishermen compared stories that became slightly larger with every retelling. A young couple posed for wedding photographs beneath the old oak tree, overlooking the reservoir. To everyone who had moved into Maple Ridge after the storm, it looked as though the lake had always been this peaceful. Garrett hoped they would always believe that. The dam looked different now, not dramatically. The aging concrete had been carefully repaired. New monitoring instruments had been installed along the crest. The 60-year-old outlet valve remained exactly where it had always been. It had not been replaced, only restored. Michael Lawson had insisted on that decision. Good engineering, he had said during construction, isn't about replacing history. It's about making history dependable. Inside the control house, one shelf looked different. Walter Hollis's handwritten maintenance logs had been digitized. Every inspection, every repair, every handwritten note, protected in both paper and electronic form. Beside them sat a small bronze plaque installed by the County Infrastructure Stewardship Initiative. It read, "This structure protects more than property. It protects a community." The county's new program had quietly expanded. 23 privately owned water control structures had completed engineering reviews. Historical records, once scattered across garages, filing cabinets, and forgotten archives, had been consolidated into a single secure database. Ownership still mattered, but institutional memory no longer depended on one person's attic, one retirement, or one forgotten box. The Maple Ridge story had changed more than one lake. It had changed a system. Barbara Kingsley had chosen not to seek another term as HOA president, not because she had been forced out, because she believed leadership also meant knowing when someone else should lead. Before leaving office, she established a permanent infrastructure review committee. Its first rule appeared at the top of every meeting agenda. Review the evidence before discussing opinions. Simple, practical. Walter Hollis would have approved. Daniel Pierce still visited the dam every spring, not because regulations required him to, because he enjoyed walking the crest with Garrett. They rarely discussed lawsuits, or politics, or the hearing. Instead, they talked about rainfall, concrete, maintenance schedules, the kinds of conversations that prevented dramatic stories from ever happening again. One quiet Saturday morning, Frank Delaney joined them carrying 3 cups of coffee. He looked across the water. Funny. Garrett smiled. What is a year ago, everybody thought this lake was the story. He pointed toward the dam. It never was. Garrett nodded. No, it was always the people willing to take care of it. Later that afternoon, Garrett unlocked the small archive cabinet inside the control house. He removed Walter's letter one final time. He read only the last paragraph. If you did your job correctly, people will never know how much they owe you. Don't resent that. Be grateful for it, because invisible success is still success. Garrett folded the letter carefully. Then, instead of returning it to his own desk, he placed it inside the community archive, not because it belonged to him, because it belonged to everyone who would one day inherit the responsibility of caring for the dam. Legacies survived longest when they stopped belonging to one family. As the sun began to set, Garrett walked alone across the crest of the dam one final time. He rested his hand briefly against the restored valve housing. The steel felt cool beneath his palm, the same steel his grandfather had touched. The same valve that had quietly created enough space for a storm that never became a tragedy. He smiled, then continued walking. No photographers followed him. No reporters asked for interviews. No one applauded, and somehow, that felt exactly right. Years later, most people in Maple Ridge would remember that summer for its beautiful sunsets. They would remember fishing tournaments, holiday boat parades, children learning to paddle for the first time. They wouldn't remember the engineering reports. They wouldn't remember the emergency hearing. They wouldn't remember the mornings a 6-year-old valve quietly opened before sunrise, because none of those moments became history. Only the lake remained. And Garrett finally understood what his grandfather had meant all those years ago. People remembered what they could see. They forgot what had quietly protected them. The greatest success isn't building something people admire. It's building something so dependable that future generations never have to wonder what might have happened without it.